Carl Jung explained. 10 spiritual experiences you face in the dark night of the soul. Jung's most dangerous discovery wasn't about healing mental illness. It was about what happens when your soul decides you're living a lie. Between 1913 and 1916, Carl Jung, the most brilliant psychiatrist of his generation, deliberately descended into what he called my confrontation with the unconscious. What he found there wasn't madness. It was an initiation, a systematic psychological dismemberment that looked identical to psychosis, but followed ancient patterns of death and rebirth that shamans, mystics, and saints had navigated for millennia. Jung barely survived, his private journals hidden for decades, and only published as the Red Book in 2009, reveal a man on the edge of suicide, hearing voices, experiencing visions of apocalypse, convinced he was going insane. He wrote, "I stood on the edge of the abyss. One false step and I would have been swallowed by the darkness forever." But here's what they don't teach you in psychology courses. Jung wasn't having a breakdown. He was having a breakthrough that required his old self to die. And the 10 specific experiences he documented during those 3 years, the visions, the void, the encounters with autonomous inner figures, the complete dissolution of meaning, weren't symptoms of disease. They were the soul's immune response to a life built on lies, persona, and collective conditioning. This is the dark night of the soul. And if you're watching this video, there's a strong chance you're either in it right now, about to enter it, or you've survived it and are trying to make sense of what happened to you. Let me tell you the truth that will save your life. The dark night isn't a problem to solve. It's not depression to medicate away. It's not a spiritual crisis to coach yourself out of with affirmations and gratitude journals. It's an alchemical death, a purposeful disintegration initiated by the deepest part of your psyche when it decides that the false self you've been performing must die so your authentic self can finally be born. And it will destroy you if you fight it, or transform you if you surrender to it consciously. The stakes are catastrophic. Right now, millions of people are experiencing this initiatory death. They're being diagnosed with major depressive disorder, bipolar II, treatment-resistant anxiety. They're being medicated, hospitalized, told they have a chemical imbalance. Some of them do need that intervention, but many, perhaps most, are being pathologized for experiencing the most important psychological event of their entire lives. They're having their transformation aborted at the exact moment when their soul is trying to birth them into authenticity. Jung knew this. He documented it meticulously, but he also knew how dangerous this knowledge was, because the dark night of the soul doesn't just feel like dying, it is dying. The ego structure that has organized your entire reality, your sense of identity, meaning, purpose, your relationship to others, your understanding of what's real, that structure undergoes systematic demolition. And if you don't understand what's happening, if you have no map through this territory, you can be permanently destroyed by it. Psychosis, suicide, complete ego fragmentation that never reintegrates. These aren't hypothetical dangers. Jung witnessed them. He came perilously close to them himself. The line between transformative dark night and permanent madness is razor thin, and it's marked by one thing only: consciousness. Conscious navigation of ego death leads to individuation, becoming who you actually are beneath all the conditioning. Unconscious thrashing and ego death leads to pathology, fragmentation, inflation, possession by unconscious contents that obliterate the personality. But here's the forbidden truth Jung documented in his private writings but rarely published in his mainstream work. The dark night should be terrifying. It should feel like insanity, because what's happening to you isn't natural within the framework of consensus reality. Your psyche is operating according to deeper laws. archetypal patterns of death and rebirth that predate human civilization, that are encoded in shamanic initiation rites, mystical traditions, and the hero's journey across every culture. You're not having a breakdown, you're having a breakthrough into a dimension of consciousness that the modern world has forgotten exists. Instagram spirituality has romanticized this process into something it's not. You see posts about spiritual awakening with sunset photos and quotes about gratitude. That's not the dark night. The dark night is waking up one morning and not remembering why anything matters. It's looking at your children's faces and feeling like you're watching actors in a play. It's achieving everything you thought you wanted and feeling absolutely nothing. It's standing in your own life and experiencing complete depersonalization, as if you're watching someone else live in your body. It's the ground disappearing beneath you. It's every source of meaning turning to ash in your hands. It's the terrifying recognition that you've spent decades building a life that isn't yours, wearing a costume you can't take off, performing a role written by parents, culture, expectations, trauma, everyone except you. And then, most terrifying of all, the costume starts dissolving, the role starts unraveling, the familiar sense of I begins to fragment, and you can't tell if you're dying, going crazy, or waking up from a dream you didn't know you were having. Jung called this enantiodromia, the principle that everything eventually becomes its opposite. When the ego becomes too inflated, thinking it's in control of life, or too deflated, crushed by life's demands, the unconscious initiates a compensatory response. It sends up contents that the ego cannot assimilate, cannot control, cannot understand. It floods the conscious mind with visions, synchronicities, shadow eruptions, mystical experiences, and most devastatingly, it removes the one thing the ego depends on, the illusion of meaning. Because meaning, as the ego constructs it, is always borrowed. It's cobbled together from what parents valued, what society rewards, what trauma taught you to prioritize, what your wounded inner child decided would keep you safe. None of it is authentic, and the self, the totality of who you are, including the unconscious, knows this. So it systematically demolishes the borrowed meaning structure so that genuine meaning can emerge from your actual essence. But the demolition phase, that's the dark night. And it's pure hell. What I'm about to show you in this video are the 10 specific non-ordinary experiences that occur during this psychological crucifixion. These aren't metaphors, they're not spiritual poetry. They're phenomenological realities reported consistently by people across centuries, cultures, and contexts when they're undergoing this initiatory death. Jung documented them. Saint John of the Cross, the 16th century mystic who gave this experience its name, documented them. Contemporary research in transpersonal psychology is documenting them right now in people having spiritual emergencies who end up in psychiatric wards. Each of these 10 experiences has a psychological function. Each one is dismantling a specific aspect of ego structure. Each one is terrifying when you're in it and transformative when you understand it. And each one, if navigated unconsciously, can destroy you. But navigated consciously with the right map, the right practices, and the understanding that you're not going crazy but undergoing metamorphosis, they become the path through death to rebirth. Jung survived his dark night by doing something radical. He stopped fighting it. He stopped trying to explain it rationally. He stopped trying to fix himself. Instead, he developed a practice he called active imagination, consciously engaging with the autonomous figures appearing in his visions, dialoguing with them, learning their symbolic language, allowing them to teach him about the unconscious contents that were erupting into consciousness. He drew, he painted, he wrote his visions in elaborate calligraphy in the manuscript that would become the Red Book. He treated the experience not as pathology but as initiation, not as breakdown but as breakthrough, requiring symbolic death of his old self so something truer could emerge. And what emerged from those 3 years was the entire framework of depth psychology. Everything we know about archetypes, the collective unconscious, the shadow, individuation, the self, it all came from Jung's willingness to descend into his own underworld and return with the treasure. But he paid a terrible price. He lost his professional reputation for years. His colleagues thought he'd gone insane. His wife nearly left him. He came close to suicide multiple times. He experienced such profound ego dissolution that he couldn't tell what was real anymore. And in his private notes he admitted, "I can't know if I'm a madman or a prophet. Perhaps both." That's the knife edge of the dark night. Madness or initiation, psychosis or metamorphosis. The difference is consciousness, the capacity to hold symbolic awareness while experiencing literal dissolution. This video will give you the map Jung created, the 10 experiences you face, the dangers at each stage, the practices that save your life, and most importantly, the understanding that if you're in the dark night right now, you're not broken, you're being broken open. Your soul has decided it's time, and your only choice is, will you die consciously or unconsciously? Will you resist and be destroyed, or surrender and be transformed? Let's begin with the terrifying recognition that starts it all. The moment when everything that previously gave your life meaning suddenly becomes hollow, weightless, and utterly empty. The psychological condition you're facing has a clinical name that Jung used sparingly because he knew how dangerous it would sound to modern ears. Ego death initiation. This is not depression. Depression is when you feel terrible about life, but life still has recognizable structure and meaning. This is when life itself becomes unrecognizable, when you wake up in your own existence and can't remember why you care about any of it, when the entire scaffolding of meaning that held your reality together just disappears. Overnight, sometimes. More often, gradually, like watching a photograph fade in reverse, the colors draining out until you're staring at something that used to be vibrant and now you can't remember why it mattered. Jung understood this as the most dangerous phase of individuation, the process by which a person becomes their authentic self rather than who they've been conditioned to be. Because individuation isn't gentle, it's not a smooth evolution, it's a violent revolution. The psyche doesn't negotiate. When it's time for transformation, it initiates a coup. It overthrows the ego government that's been running your life and floods consciousness with contents that the ego cannot control, cannot understand, cannot assimilate. And the ego, faced with this invasion from the unconscious, does what any government under siege does. It declares a state of emergency. It tries to re-establish control. It fights, it denies, it medicates, it distracts. It performs harder at the roles that used to provide identity and meaning, but none of it works, because the self, the totality of the psyche, including all unconscious contents, has decided it's time. And when the self decides, the ego has no choice but to submit or be destroyed. Here's what ego death initiation looks like in real life, in real people right now. You're a successful professional. Maybe you're a doctor, lawyer, executive, teacher, someone who achieved what society told you achievement looks like. You have the career, the relationship, the house, maybe children. You did everything right. You checked all the boxes. And one morning you wake up and realize with absolute horror, none of this is yours. You're living someone else's life, performing someone else's script, and you can't remember when you stopped being real. That recognition, that's the initiation beginning, or you experience trauma, death of a parent, divorce, illness, job loss. Something breaks the continuity of your identity, and instead of grief moving through in stages like psychology promised, it opens a trap door beneath your entire worldview. You fall through into something vast and dark and terrifying, where nothing you believed about life, meaning, or yourself makes sense anymore. That's the initiation beginning, or nothing external happens at all. You're fine. Life is fine. Everything is objectively fine. But you start experiencing what Jung called unreality, the sensation that you're watching your life through glass, that you're not actually here, that everyone around you is asleep, and you're the only one who's woken up to the fact that none of this makes sense, that all of human life is a collective performance that everyone's agreed to pretend is real. Depersonalization, derealization, these are the psychiatric terms, but they're not symptoms of illness. They're symptoms of the psyche showing you the truth. The self you think you are is a construct, and that construct is dissolving. The core symptoms of ego death initiation cluster around several unmistakable patterns. First, the death of meaning. Everything that previously organized your life into coherent purpose suddenly becomes weightless. Your career? You can't remember why you chose it. Your relationships? You're performing love but not feeling it. Your hobbies, your goals, your spiritual practices, all of it turns to ash. You're going through motions, but you're not there. You're a ghost in your own life. This isn't depression's heaviness. It's worse. It's the lightness of total meaninglessness. Everything becomes arbitrary. Why get out of bed? Why not? Neither matters. Why pursue anything? Why maintain relationships? Why care about anything when nothing carries inherent importance? The ego, which organizes reality through meaning-making, suddenly loses that function, and without meaning, the ego structure starts to crumble. Second, identity fragmentation. You start losing your sense of coherent self. The I that you've taken for granted your whole life starts feeling fake, performed, or absent altogether. You might look in the mirror and not recognize yourself. Not metaphorically, literally. The face looking back seems wrong, unfamiliar, or like a stranger wearing your features. You lose track of your personality. Are you introverted or extroverted? You can't tell anymore. What are your preferences, your values, your beliefs? They all feel like costumes you put on depending on context, but none of them feel true. Who are you when you're alone? You can't find anyone there. Just emptiness or fragments or the horrifying sense that you never existed at all. You've been a collection of responses to others' expectations, a trauma-generated persona, but never an actual person. Jung called these ego boundary dissolution experiences, the edge between self and other, inner and outer, real and unreal. They all become permeable, fluid, unreliable. You might be having a conversation and suddenly not know where your thoughts end and the other person's begin. You might look at nature and feel yourself dissolving into it, not in a blissful way, but in a terrifying loss of separation. Third, the flooding of unconscious contents. Dreams become apocalyptic, vivid beyond anything you've experienced. You dream of drowning, burning, being buried alive, cities crumbling, the world ending. You dream of death, your own death, over and over in different variations. Dismemberment, dissolution, descent into darkness. But these aren't random nightmares. They're symbolic communications from the unconscious, showing you the death-rebirth process your psyche is undergoing. The ego doesn't want to hear this. The ego wants the dreams to stop, but they intensify. Then waking visions start. You might be driving and suddenly see death as a presence in the passenger seat. Not metaphorically, you sense it, feel it, know it's there. You might be alone in your house and feel the presence of something vast and ancient watching you. Numinous presences, archetypal figures, autonomous entities that seem to have intelligence independent of your conscious mind. Jung experienced this terrifyingly during his confrontation with the unconscious. He would be sitting in his study and a figure would appear, Philemon, an old man with wings of a kingfisher, who spoke to him with wisdom Jung couldn't have generated himself. Salome, a blind woman who represented dangerous feminine power. The Red One, a serpent-like figure who brought knowledge from the underworld. These weren't hallucinations. Or rather, they were, but they were purposeful hallucinations. They were the unconscious personifying itself, so it could communicate with consciousness in symbolic language. Most people experiencing this think they're going insane, and they might be. The line between productive engagement with the unconscious and psychotic break is determined by one factor. Can you maintain ego boundaries while allowing the unconscious to speak? Can you know that what you're experiencing is symbolic while still taking it seriously? If you can't, if the ego completely dissolves, you cross into psychosis. The archetypes possess you. You become Philemon or Salome rather than relating to them. You believe you're Jesus or the Antichrist rather than recognizing these as symbolic representations of self or shadow. Fourth, physical and somatic. Dysregulation. The dark night isn't just psychological. Your body registers the ego death. You might experience chronic fatigue that no amount of sleep relieves, physical pain that moves around your body with no medical cause, digestive shutdown, insomnia, or hypersomnia, losing or gaining significant weight without changing habits, feeling like you're dying even though medical tests show nothing wrong. Jung noted that the psyche and soma are one system. When psyche undergoes violent reorganization, soma reflects it. Your body is trying to ground the massive energetic shift happening in consciousness, and it often can't keep up. Energy practitioners would recognize this as kundalini activation without proper vessel preparation. Somatic therapists see it as trauma release. Jung understood it as the self's emergence requiring the entire body-mind system to reconfigure. Fifth, the imperative to withdraw. You can't maintain normal social functioning. Small talk becomes physically painful. Being around people, even people you love, feels like wearing sandpaper clothes. You cancel plans obsessively. You stop answering texts. You fantasize about disappearing entirely, not suicide, but vanishing into a cave, a monastery, the wilderness, anywhere you can be alone with whatever's happening to you. This isn't depression's social withdrawal, which comes from shame or exhaustion. This is a sacred hermitage imperative. Your psyche needs protected space away from social performance demands because you're undergoing an internal transformation so profound that you cannot simultaneously maintain external persona. The mask is crumbling. You can't perform being a functional human while your fundamental sense of self is disintegrating. Jung withdrew significantly during his Red Book years. He couldn't see patients full-time. He built a retreat at Bollingen where he could be alone with stone, water, and his active imagination practice. He recognized that ego death requires isolation the way childbirth requires labor, a protected space where vulnerable transformation can occur without interruption. Sixth, spiritual experiences you didn't ask for. If you've never been spiritual, suddenly you're having mystical experiences. If you've been spiritual, your practices stop working or become doorways to terrifying dimensions you didn't know existed. You might experience a spontaneous kundalini activation with energy surging up your spine, out-of-body experiences while you're just sitting at your desk, feeling the presence of the divine as something vast and terrifying, rather than comforting, seeing the interconnection of all things not as beautiful, but as obliterating your sense of separate self. These experiences are the self breaking through the ego's defensive structures. The self is numinous. It evokes awe and terror simultaneously. Rudolf Otto, whom Jung studied extensively, called this the mysterium tremendum et fascinans, the mystery that makes you tremble with terror and fascination at once. Most modern spirituality sanitizes this. It presents awakening as peaceful, blissful, enlightening in a gentle way. That's not awakening. That's spiritual bypassing. Real awakening, real encounter with the self, is terrifying because it shows you that what you thought was you is a tiny fragment of something infinitely larger, and that larger thing is taking over. So here's the diagnostic truth that no one wants to say clearly. If you're experiencing most or all of these symptoms, you're not having a depressive episode that needs fixing. You're undergoing an initiatory crisis. Your psyche has decided that the ego structure organizing your life is false, insufficient, or built on trauma and conditioning rather than authentic being. And it's systematically demolishing that structure so a new one can form, organized around the self rather than persona, around essence rather than performance, around truth rather than safety. The problem is catastrophic because modern culture provides no container for this, no roadmap, no elders who've walked this path, no collective understanding that psychological death is a developmental necessity for some people at certain life stages. So you go to a doctor who prescribes antidepressants. You go to a therapist who tries to help you reframe your thoughts. You go to a spiritual teacher who tells you to raise your vibration. And none of it works because none of it understands what's actually happening. You're dying. The you that you thought you were is undergoing systematic execution by your own soul. And the only way through is complete surrender to the process, which feels indistinguishable from surrender to madness or death. That's the problem. The question becomes, is there a way through that doesn't end in psychosis, suicide, or permanent fragmentation? Can ego death lead to ego rebirth rather than ego obliteration? Jung's answer, earned through surviving his own near destruction, was yes, but only if you understand the 10 specific experiences you'll face in the underworld, and how to navigate each one consciously rather than being destroyed by it. Let me show you what that looks like in a real human life. What happens when the dark night descends on someone unprepared, and the choice between madness and transformation becomes the only choice that matters. His name was David. On paper, he had everything figured out. 44 years old, successful architect, married 16 years, 2 children, house in a good neighborhood, respect from colleagues, health, stability, everything that consensus reality defines as making it. On a Tuesday afternoon in March, standing in his office reviewing blueprints for a project he'd spent 3 months designing, David felt the ground disappear. Not metaphorically. He described it later as the sensation of falling through the floor while remaining perfectly still. The blueprints in front of him suddenly looked like meaningless lines on paper. His office, the space where he'd spent thousands of hours creating, designing, problem-solving, felt like a stage set. Fake, empty, wrong. He looked down at his hands, holding the pen, and thought, who is this person? What am I doing here? Why does any of this matter? And he couldn't find an answer. That evening at dinner with his family, he looked at his wife across the table and felt nothing, not anger, not love, not familiarity, just a strange, detached observation. I'm sitting here pretending to be a husband. His children were talking about their day at school. Their voices sounded like they were coming from underwater. He heard himself responding, asking follow-up questions, performing fatherhood. But he wasn't there. He was watching someone who looked like him go through the motions of a life that suddenly felt completely alien. His wife asked if he was okay. He said he was tired. That night, lying in bed next to her, he stared at the ceiling in the dark, experiencing what he'd later learn was profound depersonalization, the sensation that he was outside his own body, watching himself exist but not actually existing. He didn't sleep. At 3 a.m., he walked downstairs to his study and sat in the dark. And for the first time in his adult life, David asked himself the question that has no safe answer. Who am I when I'm not performing all these roles? The answer that came back was terrifying. No one, nothing, emptiness. That was the beginning of David's 10-month descent into the dark night of the soul. Within 2 weeks, he couldn't function at work. Projects that used to engage him intellectually felt pointless. Why design buildings? What does it matter if they're beautiful or functional? Buildings don't matter. Nothing matters. He'd sit in client meetings nodding along, but inside, he was drowning in a vast sea of meaninglessness. He took medical leave, telling his partners he was experiencing burnout. But it wasn't burnout. Burnout is exhaustion from too much work. This was exhaustion from existence itself. He felt tired in his soul. If souls could be tired. Tired of pretending. Tired of performing. Tired of being a person when he couldn't remember what being a person actually meant. His wife grew increasingly concerned. She'd ask what was wrong, and he couldn't explain because he didn't have words for it. How do you tell someone that you've forgotten why being alive has purpose? That you look at your children and feel love in theory but not in experience? That every morning you wake up, you're surprised you're still here, and not in a suicidal way, but in a "why am I still doing this" way? She suggested couples therapy. They went. The therapist asked David to identify his feelings. He couldn't. He didn't have feelings. He had a vast emptiness where feelings used to be. The therapist suggested individual therapy for depression. David went to a psychiatrist who spent 15 minutes with him and prescribed an SSRI and a sleep medication. David took the pills for 3 weeks. They didn't help. Or rather, they created a chemical distance that made the emptiness more tolerable, but also more permanent feeling. He stopped taking them. His wife was furious. "You're not even trying to get better." But he wasn't sick. That's what she couldn't understand. He was dying, but not physically. Something inside him was being systematically killed, and he didn't know if he should fight it or let it happen. Then the dreams started. Every night, apocalyptic dreams, cities crumbling into the ocean, the world on fire, dreams where he was drowning, suffocating, being buried alive, dreams where he was murdered, dismembered, his body parts scattered, dreams where he died and watched his own funeral from above, feeling nothing about his death except mild curiosity. One dream recurred with variations. He was in a dark room. A presence was in the room with him, something ancient, vast, intelligent, not malevolent but utterly indifferent to his survival. And this presence would speak, though not with words. It would communicate directly into his understanding. Everything you think you are must die. You can resist and be destroyed, or surrender and be transformed. Choose. He'd wake up shaking, covered in sweat, the presence still palpable in his bedroom. His wife slept peacefully beside him. He felt completely alone in a way that had nothing to do with whether people were physically present. Month 3, the shadow erupted. David had always been a good person, ethical, controlled, rational. Suddenly he was having intrusive thoughts and images that horrified him. Violence fantasies toward people he loved. Sexual thoughts that violated his values, rage, volcanic, murderous rage, toward his father who died 6 months earlier. The death had seemed to trigger all of this, though David hadn't felt he was grieving incorrectly. He'd be driving and imagine swerving into oncoming traffic, not because he wanted to die, but because some part of him wanted to do something irreversible, something that would shatter the pretense of control. He'd be in the grocery store and imagine screaming, throwing things, destroying everything, just to make the external world match the chaos inside. He didn't act on any of it, but the thoughts terrified him. What was happening to him? Was he becoming a psychopath? Was this repressed trauma emerging? He started researching psychiatry symptoms online. Intrusive thoughts, dissociation, depersonalization disorder, bipolar disorder, schizoid personality disorder, Every label seemed to fit, and none seemed to fit. Month 5, synchronicities became undeniable. David had always been a rationalist, materialist worldview, skeptical of anything he couldn't measure or prove. But now, he'd think of someone he hadn't talked to in years, and within an hour they'd call or email. He'd be struggling with a question, and a book would literally fall off a shelf, open to a page. That addressed exactly what he was wrestling with. Numbers would appear, 11:11 on the clock constantly, everywhere he looked. The day he seriously contemplated suicide, he was walking through a park trying to decide if he could keep existing in this state of non-existence. A stranger walked past him and said, completely unprompted, "It gets better, trust the process," then walked away before David could respond. These weren't subtle, they were reality-shattering. The materialist worldview he'd built his life on was crumbling along with everything else. Either he was going insane, assigning meaning to random events through apophenia, or the universe was some kind of conscious intelligence that was, what? Communicating with him, teaching him, torturing him. He couldn't tell the difference between mystical experience and psychotic delusion. That terrified him more than anything. Month 7, he encountered the presence directly. He was sitting in his study at 2 a.m. He spent most nights now alone in that room, unable to sleep, unable to do anything productive, just sitting. And something entered the room, not a hallucination, not a vision, an actual presence. He felt it the way you feel when someone walks into a room behind you. You know they're there before you see them. This presence was immense. It felt older than time. It felt like it had been waiting for him his entire life. And the strangest part, it felt familiar. Like he'd always known it but had forgotten. Like it was him, but a version of him so vast that his conscious mind couldn't possibly contain it. And it spoke, not in words but in direct knowing. And what it communicated was, "I am who you actually are. Everything else must die." David wept, not sad tears, not relieved tears, just tears pouring out of him for hours, tears for the life he'd built on false foundations, tears for the self he'd been that was being killed, tears for the terror of not knowing what would be left when the death was complete. His wife found him in the morning, still sitting there. She was terrified. "I can't do this anymore," she said. "You need to go to a hospital or get serious about treatment, or I'm leaving." David understood. He looked insane. He was living in a world of presences, synchronicities, apocalyptic dreams, unable to function, unable to connect, unable to be the husband and father he'd been. From her perspective, he was choosing illness over family. From his perspective, he was being chosen by something that wouldn't let him go back to who he'd been, even if he wanted to. Month 8, the void. All the intensity, the dreams, the presences, the synchronicities, suddenly stopped. What replaced them was worse. Nothing. Absolute nothing. Not depression's heaviness, but the complete absence of affect, meaning, sensation, identity. David described this period as being erased while still technically existing. He'd sit for hours, not thinking, not feeling, not being, just a blank consciousness watching a blank world. Even the terror was gone. Even the grief was gone. There was just void. His wife moved out, taking the children. His partners at the firm formally removed him from active projects. His health deteriorated. He lost 30 pounds. His doctor found markers indicating severe stress, suggested psychiatric hospitalization. David refused, not because he was confident he didn't need it, but because some deep instinct told him, if you interrupt this process now, you'll have to go through it again later, and it will be worse. He couldn't have explained why he believed that. But he trusted it the way a woman in labor trusts, that pushing through the pain is the only way to birth. He was alone, broke, barely functional, sitting in the void, waiting. For what? He didn't know. Then, month 9, the first light. Not metaphorical. David woke up one morning and for the first time in 10 months, he felt something other than emptiness or terror. He felt curiosity, tiny, fragile, but real. He wondered, what would I actually enjoy doing today if I weren't trying to be anyone in particular? The answer that came was absurd. He wanted to paint. He'd never painted in his life. But the impulse was so clear he went to an art store and bought supplies. He spent 6 hours painting that day. The painting was terrible, but he was there, present, engaged, not performing for anyone. The next week, more small moments. A walk in the woods where he actually felt the ground under his feet. A conversation with a stranger at a coffee shop where he said true things instead of pleasant things. A dream that wasn't apocalyptic, just strange and symbolic in a way that felt like communication rather than catastrophe. Something new was forming. He didn't know what yet, but it wasn't the old David. That David was dead. Whoever this was felt lighter, quieter, less defended, capable of sitting with not knowing without needing to fill it with performance. Month 10, his wife called. She wanted to try again. David, to his own surprise, said no. Not from anger or rejection, but from clarity. I can't go back to who I was. I don't know who I'm becoming, but trying to resurrect our old relationship would be trying to resurrect someone who doesn't exist anymore. She was devastated. He was sad. But the sadness was clean, not confused. This was grief, real grief, not the void. He could feel it, hold it, let it move through him. He sold the house, split everything fairly, moved into a small apartment. He didn't return to architecture. He couldn't. Not because he couldn't do the technical work, but because he couldn't care about it in the way required for excellence. It had been his father's dream for him anyway, he realized. His father, who died 6 months before the collapse began. Instead, David started volunteering at a hospice. He didn't know why, only that he was drawn there. Being around people who were literally dying felt honest in a way most of life didn't. They weren't performing. They were just facing what's real. And David had faced what's real. He'd been through a death that looked symbolic but felt literal. He understood in his body what dying while living meant. The hospice patients recognized it in him. "You've been somewhere," one elderly woman said to him. "I can see it in your eyes." 6 months later, David trained formally as a hospice counselor. He found his work there had a quality he'd never accessed in architecture. He could sit with people in their terror without trying to fix it. He could hold space for death, literal and metaphorical, without needing it to mean something other than what it was. His own dark night had initiated him into what Jung called the wounded healer, someone who has descended to their own underworld and can therefore guide others through theirs. The David who existed after the dark night was fundamentally different from the one before. His face had changed, not physically, but in what Jung called the eyes of someone who has died and returned. He spoke more slowly, more carefully, more truthfully. He had less patience for social performance and more capacity for genuine connection. He lived more simply, earned less money, owned fewer things, but he was there, present, real. When asked if he'd undo it, if he could go back to March and prevent the falling through the floor moment, David's answer was immediate. No, I would never undo it, but I also wouldn't wish it on anyone. It's the gift disguised as annihilation. His relationship with his children slowly rebuilt, but differently. They could feel the difference in him. He was more present even though he saw them less. More honest even when honesty was harder. One of his daughters, now 17, told him, "You used to be there, but not really there. Now when you're here, you're actually here." David's dreams, 5 years post-Dark Night, are still vivid but no longer apocalyptic. They're teaching dreams now, symbolic communications he's learned to read. He maintains a daily active imagination practice, sitting in dialogue with inner figures who appeared during the crisis and never left. Philemon-like presences who offer guidance, shadow figures who keep him honest about his darkness, and what he calls the vastness, that presence that entered his study on that night in month 7, which he now understands as the self. He describes his current state as more spacious, less defended, capable of holding suffering, mine and others, without being destroyed by it. The meaninglessness that nearly killed him has transformed into what he calls groundless meaning, purpose that arises moment by moment from authentic response to life, rather than from borrowed scripts about what should matter. But here's what David wants people to know about the dark night. No one can tell you if you're having a breakdown or a breakthrough while you're in it. You can't know. The territory is identical. Mental illness and spiritual emergency look the same from inside. The difference only becomes clear in retrospect, and only if you navigate it consciously rather than being consumed by it. He lost his marriage, his career, his savings, nearly his life. And he'd make the same choice again because the alternative, medicating it away, suppressing it, returning to the false self, would have killed him more slowly but more completely. That David, he says of who he was before, was already dead. He just didn't know it yet. He was a ghost performing a life that had nothing to do with his actual soul. The dark night didn't kill him. It revealed that he'd never truly been alive. This is what we're dealing with. This is the territory. David's story is one version, but the pattern is archetypal. Millions of people right now are where David was in month 3, month 5, month 8. They're being diagnosed, medicated, hospitalized, or they're suffering in silence, thinking they're uniquely broken. They're not broken, they're breaking open. But the question remains, can we map this territory? Can we identify the specific experiences that occur during this descent so that people don't feel crazy when they're actually undergoing transformation? Can we provide the understanding that might mean the difference between David's outcome and the darker alternatives? Psychosis, suicide, permanent fragmentation. Jung believed we could. He documented his own 10-month journey and found patterns that repeated across his patients, across mystical literature, across shamanic initiations worldwide. He found that the dark night, while feeling chaotic and random, actually follows coherent stages and includes specific recurring experiences that have psychological function and symbolic meaning. Let me show you what contemporary research reveals about this crisis and why science is finally catching up to what Jung documented a century ago. For decades after Jung's death, mainstream psychology dismissed his work on the dark night as too mystical, too unscientific, too dangerous to study seriously. But in the last 30 years, something shifted. Researchers in transpersonal psychology, neuroscience, religious studies, and trauma theory began documenting the same phenomena Jung described and finding that he was right. The dark night of the soul isn't random suffering. It's a coherent developmental process with identifiable stages, consistent phenomenology, and predictable patterns across cultures and centuries. Modern research has given us the tools to validate what mystics and depth psychologists always knew. Ego death is real, it serves a function, and it follows laws as predictable as any other psychological process. Let's start with the neuroscience of ego dissolution. Studies using fMRI and psychedelic-assisted therapy have revealed what happens in the brain during experiences of self-dissolution. The default mode network, a collection of brain regions responsible for self-referential thinking, autobiographical memory, and the sense of being a separate self, shows dramatically decreased activity during ego death experiences. Dr. Robin Carhart Harris at Imperial College London has been studying this intensively. His research shows that when the default mode network quiets, brain regions that normally don't communicate begin forming new connections. The boundaries between sensory processing, memory, and emotion become permeable. The brain's normal filtering mechanism, which creates consensus reality by filtering out the majority of sensory and unconscious information, temporarily suspends. What does this mean practically? During the dark night, your brain is literally reorganizing its fundamental architecture. The neural patterns that created your sense of separate self, your narrative identity, your meaning-making structures, they're being deconstructed. This isn't metaphorical. It's measurable brain activity changes. And here's the critical insight. This process looks identical in brain scans, whether it's induced by psychedelics, intensive meditation, spontaneous spiritual emergency, or the dark night of the soul. The common factor is ego dissolution, the temporary or extended suspension of the brain's self-construct. Dr. Roland Griffiths at Johns Hopkins has documented that these ego death experiences, when properly supported, lead to lasting positive changes in personality, specifically increased openness, decreased fear of death, and what researchers call persisting positive changes in attitudes, mood, and behavior. But, and this is crucial, when these experiences occur without support, without integration, without understanding of what's happening, they can lead to lasting trauma, depersonalization disorder, or psychotic breaks. The difference between transformation and trauma isn't the experience itself, it's the container holding it. This brings us to Stanislav Grof's groundbreaking work on spiritual emergency. Grof, a Czech psychiatrist who worked extensively with LSD therapy before it was criminalized, spent 50 years documenting non-ordinary states of consciousness. He identified what he called spiritual emergency, a crisis in which the process of growth and transformation becomes overwhelming, leading to psychological crisis that resembles mental illness, but has different dynamics and different outcomes if treated differently. Grof's research revealed that spiritual emergencies follow patterns found in shamanic initiation across cultures: ego death, descent to the underworld, dismemberment, encounter with death, confrontation with terrifying forces, death and rebirth symbolism, and eventual return with new capacity and wisdom. He documented that people experiencing spiritual emergency often present at psychiatric hospitals with symptoms identical to psychosis: hearing voices, experiencing visions, feeling persecuted by forces beyond understanding, losing connection with consensus, reality, experiencing ego dissolution. The critical difference? People in spiritual emergency maintain what Grof called the observing self. Some part of them can witness what's happening and knows it's not literal, even while experiencing it as overwhelmingly real. This matches exactly what Jung described as the difference between productive confrontation with the unconscious and psychotic breakdown: symbolic awareness. Can you hold that the archetypal figures appearing to you are autonomous aspects of your psyche rather than believing they're external entities? Can you recognize that the death you're experiencing is ego death rather than believing you're literally dying? If yes, with proper support, spiritual emergency becomes transformative. If no, it becomes pathology. Grof founded the Spiritual Emergence Network in the 1980s to train therapists to recognize this distinction and provide appropriate support rather than immediately medicating. His work validated Jung's insistence that not all psychological crises should be pathologized. Some are necessary developmental processes that Western psychiatry has lost the framework to recognize. Now let's look at the research on post-traumatic growth and crisis-induced transformation. Dr. Stephen Joseph and others studying post-traumatic growth have found that people who undergo severe psychological crisis, trauma, loss, life-threatening illness, often emerge more psychologically integrated than people who never faced such crisis. The key factors that determine whether crisis leads to growth or chronic dysfunction are strikingly similar to what Jung described. Finding meaning in the experience, not positive reframing but genuine existential meaning-making. Having social support that doesn't pathologize or rush the process. Maintaining some capacity for reflection, even during acute crisis. Willingness to let previous identity structures dissolve rather than rigidly defending them. Time, genuine transformation takes years, not weeks. The research shows that transformation through crisis isn't gentle. It involves genuine suffering, genuine loss, genuine death of previous self-structures. But people who complete the process describe fundamentally altered relationships to life, death, meaning, and self. They use language identical to religious conversion experiences and mystical union, not because they've become religious, but because they've undergone psychological death and rebirth that changes their fundamental consciousness structure. This connects to research on meaning-making and narrative identity. Psychologists studying how humans create coherent life narratives have found that the brain must periodically destroy old narrative structures to build more complex ones. Dan McAdams's research on narrative identity shows that people who've undergone what he calls redemptive sequences, say suffering that leads to transformation, have more complex, integrated, and resilient life narratives than people whose stories remain simple and unchallenged. But here's the painful part. To build a more complex narrative, the old one must be demolished. The brain can't just add new information to an outdated framework. It has to break down the framework and rebuild it. This process is experienced as the loss of coherent self, the death of meaning, the collapse of identity, all core dark night experiences. The dark night, from this perspective, is neurological and psychological update that feels like systems failure because temporarily it is. Your operating system is being rewritten. During the rewrite, you can't function normally, but if the process completes, you emerge with expanded capacity. Now the terrifying part. Research on dissociative disorders and psychotic breaks shows that this process can go catastrophically wrong. When ego dissolution proceeds too rapidly, too completely, or without any container, the psyche can fragment in ways that don't reintegrate. Dissociative identity disorder, schizophrenia, and chronic depersonalization, derealization disorder can all result from traumatic ego dissolution that the person couldn't metabolize. The research suggests several factors that determine whether ego death leads to integration or fragmentation. Trauma history. People with unresolved trauma, especially developmental trauma, are at higher risk for pathological fragmentation because their ego structure was already fragile. The dark night can shatter what little coherent self they'd managed to construct. Social support. Complete isolation during ego death dramatically increases risk of psychotic break. Humans are relational beings. We need others to mirror reality back to us. During the dark night, having at least one person who understands this as transformation rather than illness can be the difference between integration and fragmentation. Symbolic capacity, the ability to think symbolically, to hold metaphor, to understand that images and experiences can be psychologically real without being literally real, is protective. This is a developmental capacity. People who are more concrete in thinking or who've been culturally trained to dismiss the symbolic struggle more during the dark night because they can't interpret what's happening to them. Gradual versus sudden onset. Research on psychological crisis shows that sudden onset crises triggered by trauma, psychedelic experience, or spontaneous spiritual emergency are more dangerous than gradual onset. The psyche needs time to build capacity to hold the transformation. This brings us to Jung's concept of enantiodromia, the principle that everything eventually becomes its opposite. Jung observed that when the ego becomes too inflated, believing it's in complete control, or too deflated, crushed by life's demands, the unconscious initiates a compensatory response. The psyche seeks balance, but not gentle balance. When imbalance becomes extreme, the correction is violent. A person who's lived in extreme ego inflation, narcissistic personality structure, grandiosity, denial of vulnerability, will eventually experience catastrophic deflation. The shadow they've denied erupts. The vulnerability they've repressed overwhelms them. The dark night for them is the compensatory swing from inflation to complete ego dissolution. A person who's lived in extreme ego deflation, depression, self-abnegation, victim identity, may experience enantiodromia as spontaneous inflation, spiritual emergency where they suddenly believe they're enlightened, chosen, special. This can look like mania or spiritual inflation, and it's just as dangerous. The dark night is often enantiodromia in action, the psyche's forced rebalancing when voluntary transformation has been refused too long. Research on contemplative traditions validates this. Studies of advanced meditators have found that prolonged intensive practice often triggers what Buddhist psychology calls the dukkha nanas, stages of insight characterized by psychological suffering, ego dissolution, dark visions, and the collapse of meaning. The phenomenology matches the dark night exactly. Buddhist teacher Shinzen Jung and others have documented what they call the dark night of the soul in meditation practice, a stage where practitioners experience terror, meaninglessness, ego dissolution, and sometimes temporary psychotic symptoms. This isn't a meditation failure. It's a predictable stage on the path to deeper awakening, recognized and mapped for thousands of years in Buddhist psychology. But here's what's crucial. Traditional contemplative systems have maps, teachers, and practices specifically designed to navigate these stages. Modern secular life doesn't. So people enter the dark night through meditation, psychedelics, or spontaneous crisis, and they have no framework, no guidance, no understanding that this is a stage rather than a permanent state. The research from various wisdom traditions, Christian mysticism, Sufism, Kabbalah, Hindu yoga, Buddhist insight practice, all document the same stages: initial spiritual opening, period of grace and bliss, sudden reversal into darkness and suffering, prolonged period of ego death and meaninglessness, eventual emergence with transformed consciousness. Saint John of the Cross, the 16th century mystic who named this experience, described two dark nights: the dark night of the senses, where attachment to pleasure and pain dissolves, and the dark night of the soul, where the ego itself dissolves. His maps match Jung's phenomenology exactly, just using religious language rather than psychological. Finally, research on synchronicity, Jung's concept of meaningful coincidence, has found correlations we can now measure. Studies on ASI phenomena, meaningful coincidence, and what Dean Radin calls entangled minds, suggest that during states of expanded consciousness or ego dissolution, the normal boundaries between self and world become permeable in ways that allow for information transfer that doesn't follow mechanistic causation. Whether you interpret this as genuine psi ability, heightened pattern recognition, or selective attention bias, the research confirms that people undergoing spiritual emergency and dark night experiences report dramatically increased synchronicities, and these synchronicities serve a function, their guidance system when rational mind has failed. Jung called this the unus mundus, the unified world where psyche and matter interpenetrate. Modern physics is finding that consciousness and physical reality may be more entangled than classical science assumed. The dark night, which involves ego boundary dissolution, may allow temporary access to dimensions of reality that the ego normally filters out. So here's what all this research tells us. The dark night of the soul is real. It's a coherent developmental process involving measurable brain changes, following patterns documented across cultures and throughout history. It serves the function of ego death and reconstruction, allowing for more complex consciousness to emerge. It's dangerous. It can lead to pathology if navigated unconsciously, but it's also potentially the most important psychological event in a person's life if navigated consciously with proper support and understanding. Jung wasn't romanticizing or mystifying mental illness. He was documenting a genuine phenomenon that modern research is now validating. The tragedy is that most people experiencing this are being pathologized, medicated, or dismissed, rather than supported through a transformation that could fundamentally shift their consciousness and their life. Now, let's map the specific 10 experiences that occur during this journey, the landmarks in the territory of ego death that signal you're not going crazy but undergoing metamorphosis. These aren't metaphors, they're not spiritual poetry. What follows are 10 specific non-ordinary experiences that occur during the dark night of the soul, with such consistency across people, cultures, and centuries that we can identify them as archetypal stages of ego death and rebirth. Each experience has phenomenology, what it feels like from inside. Each has psychological function, what it's doing to your psyche. Each has danger points, where it can go catastrophically wrong. And each has navigation guidance, how to work with it consciously rather than being destroyed by it. If you're in the dark night now, you'll recognize yourself in multiple experiences. They don't occur in strict sequence. They overlap, cycle, intensify, and diminish. But together, they map the complete territory of psychological death and rebirth. Experience 1. The death of meaning, existential annihilation. What it feels like. You wake up one morning and nothing matters. Not in the depressed sense of life is hard and I'm tired. In the existential sense of there is no inherent meaning in anything and I can't pretend there is anymore. Your career, the thing you've dedicated years to, suddenly looks like arbitrary activity. Why do any of this? Your relationships feel like mutual performance agreements. Your children, whom you love, seem like beings you're biologically programmed to care for, but the caring feels empty. Your spiritual practices turn to ash. Prayers feel like talking to yourself. Meditation becomes sitting with nothing. It's not that you're thinking negatively, it's that you can't locate the source of mattering. Everything is weightless, arbitrary, meaningless, not because it's bad, but because meaning itself has disappeared as a category. You look at people rushing to work, raising families, pursuing goals, and you can't understand how they care. You feel like you've woken from a collective dream and everyone else is still asleep and you can't get back to sleep and you can't bear being awake alone. What's actually happening? The ego's meaning-making function is being suspended. Your psyche has recognized that all your sources of meaning, what you should value, what's important, what makes life worthwhile, have been borrowed from outside. Parents, culture, trauma responses, survival strategies, none of it is authentically yours. So the psyche is demolishing the scaffolding of borrowed meaning. It's clearing the ground, destroying the false temple so a true one can be built. But there's a gap, a terrible gap, between destruction and reconstruction, and in that gap, there's nothing. Jung called this loss of soul, the moment when persona and ego identifications collapse and nothing has replaced them yet. The ego needs meaning to function. Meaning is how it organizes chaos into coherent narrative. Without meaning, the ego's structure itself begins to crumble. The archetypal pattern, the wasteland in mythology, the desert, the barren land, the kingdom where nothing grows, the death card in tarot, endings, letting go, the necessity of loss. Saturn's domain, where structure dissolves, where time reveals everything as temporary, where cold truth strips away illusion. This is the nigredo phase in alchemy, the blackening where the prima materia, original matter of the self, is reduced to formless darkness before it can be transformed into gold. The psychological reality: your psyche isn't attacking you. It's not punishment, it's preparation. Authentic meaning, meaning that comes from your actual essence rather than from conditioning, can only emerge from groundlessness. You have to stand in the void of no meaning long enough to discover what meaning wants to emerge from your depths rather than from your defenses. This is terrifying because the ego experiences it as death. If nothing matters, why stay alive? But that's exactly the question the self is asking the ego. Why are you staying alive? What's your authentic answer, not your programmed answer? The danger points: nihilistic collapse. Believing this meaninglessness is the ultimate truth rather than a necessary stage. Suicide risk is highest here because the ego, unable to find meaning, concludes that non-existence is preferable to this empty existence. The other danger: premature grasping at replacement meaning. Joining a cult, getting obsessed with a cause, suddenly becoming religious or militantly atheist, finding new ideology to fill the void. This aborts the process. The void hasn't been metabolized, it's just been covered with new, borrowed meaning. How to navigate it? Sit in the void without filling it. This is the most counterintuitive guidance possible, but it's essential. Your psyche needs you to bear the unbearable, to tolerate meaninglessness without immediately generating new meaning. Journal the nothingness. Write "nothing matters" 100 times if that's what's true. Let yourself fully feel the weight of existential emptiness. Don't spiritually bypass with gratitude practices or positive reframing. Don't philosophically bypass by reading about meaning. Just be with the void. Trust that this has purpose even when purpose has died. The void is fertile. It's the pregnant darkness before creation. But only if you don't abort the pregnancy by forcing premature birth of new meaning. And crucially, assess suicide risk honestly. If you're thinking about ending your life, tell someone. The ego's interpretation that physical death solves existential death is a tragic misunderstanding, but in the void, that misunderstanding can feel absolutely convincing. Experience 2. Ego dissolution experiences, the disappearing self. What it feels like. You're washing dishes and suddenly there's just washing, no you doing it. The sense of being a separate self temporarily vanishes. You're not unconscious, awareness is there, but the I that's usually at the center of experience just isn't. Or you're in conversation and you lose track of where your thoughts end and the other person's begin. Or you look in the mirror and don't recognize yourself, not metaphorically, literally. The face looking back is a stranger's face. Or you're walking down the street and suddenly feel like you're watching yourself from outside your body. Or you're existing but not existing, present but not present, like a ghost haunting your own life. This is depersonalization and derealization. The boundaries of self become permeable, fluid, or absent. You can't tell what's you and what's not you. The normal filter creating the sense of separate self malfunctions. What's actually happening? Your ego boundaries are dissolving. The sense of being a separate, continuous self is a construct, a useful fiction the brain creates to navigate reality. But it's not ultimate truth, it's a tool, not the totality. During the dark night, the self is showing you this truth by temporarily removing the construct. You're experiencing what mystics call no self, or what Buddhism calls anatta. But you're experiencing it terrifyingly rather than blissfully, because your ego isn't prepared to witness its own constructed nature. Jung experienced this during his confrontation with the unconscious, and feared he was becoming schizophrenic. He'd be sitting at his desk and lose track of whether he was Jung or whether Jung was just a role being played by something larger. He'd speak to patients and feel like something else was speaking through him. The archetypal pattern, the fool in tarot, stepping off the cliff into the void, not knowing if there's ground beneath. The mystic's union experience, dissolution of separate self into cosmic consciousness. Participation mystique, the state Jung observed in indigenous cultures where boundaries between self and world are fluid rather than rigid. This is also the trickster energy, reality becoming flexible, boundaries becoming playful and terrifying, nothing solid to stand on. The psychological truth, the ego is a process, not a thing. It's a pattern of neural activity that creates the illusion of continuous separate selfhood. But it's not who you are, it's a tool you use. During ego dissolution, you're experiencing the distinction between awareness, which continues, and the ego structure, which is temporary. This is preparation for rebuilding ego around the self, rather than having ego pretend to be the totality. But the ego experiences its own revelation of constructedness as death threat, because in a sense, it is. The ego as sole authority is dying. The danger points, complete fragmentation. If ego boundaries dissolve entirely without maintaining some witnessing capacity, you cross into psychosis. You lose reality testing. You can't distinguish inner from outer, symbolic from literal, self from other. Dissociative disorders can result from repeated ego dissolution without integration. You fragment into parts that don't communicate, or you chronically experience yourself from outside, depersonalization disorder. The other danger, spiritual inflation, mistaking ego dissolution for enlightenment, believing that because you've experienced no self, you are enlightened, special, beyond ego. This is the ego hijacking the experience and inflating around it. How to work with it. Grounding practices are essential. When you feel yourself dissolving, physical exercise, cold water, texture, touching something rough, naming objects in the room out loud, placing hands on earth or floor, anything that brings you back into sensory reality and embodiment. Distinguish temporary dissolution from permanent fragmentation. Temporary dissolution is you experience no self, but can return to functional self when needed. Permanent fragmentation is you can't find your way back. You've lost all sense of continuity. You're unstable across time. Find a therapist or analyst who understands these experiences as potentially meaningful rather than only pathological. Someone who can witness you're experiencing ego dissolution. This is terrifying, and it's not permanent, and it might be serving a transformative function. And practice what Jung called symbolic attitude. Recognize that these experiences are showing you truth about the constructed nature of self, but don't literalize them into there is no self or I don't exist. The self is constructed, but the construction serves function. You're learning its relativity, not its unreality. Experience. 3. The encounter with the shadow, meeting your demons, what it feels like. Suddenly you're having thoughts and impulses that horrify you, violence fantasies toward people you love, sexual desires that violate your values, rage, volcanic, murderous rage that seems to come from nowhere, cruelty, selfishness, destructiveness. All the parts of yourself you've spent your life denying are erupting with overwhelming force. You look at your sleeping partner and imagine hurting them. You're driving and fantasize about swerving into traffic. You're at work and imagine destroying everything, screaming at everyone, burning it all down. These aren't passing thoughts. They're intrusive, persistent, powerful. You recognize your capacity for evil. You see your complicity in everything you've judged others for. You notice your jealousy, your pettiness, your manipulations, your unconscious cruelty. The good person identity you've maintained shatters. You're not good. You're capable of monstrous things. What's actually happening? Your shadow, all the parts of yourself you've disowned, denied, or repressed, is demanding recognition. During the dark night, the ego's defensive structures weaken. The shadow material you've been keeping locked in the unconscious breaks free and floods consciousness. Jung warned this is one of the most dangerous phases because the ego can be overwhelmed by shadow possession. If you can't hold the paradox that you contain darkness and light, good and evil, you risk either being possessed by the shadow, acting destructively, projecting the shadow onto others, paranoia, seeing evil everywhere, or collapsing into self-hatred, identifying entirely with the darkness. The shadow grows in proportion to ego inflation. If you've spent your life identifying as a good, moral, ethical person, your shadow contains all the repressed rage, desire, aggression, and selfishness that didn't fit that identity. During the dark night, that repressed material erupts because the false self can no longer contain it. The archetypal pattern, the devil card in tarot, confronting the demon, recognizing the chains you've created. Kaylee's destructive face, the divine force that destroys illusions through terror. The dragon in the hero's journey, the monster that must be faced, not slain, to retrieve the treasure. In myth, meeting your doppelganger, your evil twin, your dark double. The shadow as persecutor, seducer, destroyer. The psychological process, what you resist persists. Every quality you've repressed doesn't disappear. It goes underground and grows stronger. Your shadow contains all. Your unlived life, all your denied vitality, all your rejected power. The dark night forces integration by making the shadow too powerful to deny. It's saying, you will meet your darkness, you will recognize it as yours, and you will integrate it or be consumed by it. This isn't about acting on dark impulses. It's about acknowledging them, understanding them, accepting them as part of your totality. Most shadow material isn't actually evil. It's just energy that was denied because it didn't fit your persona. Integrating shadow often means reclaiming vitality, assertiveness, sexuality, anger, selfishness in balanced, conscious ways. The danger points: shadow possession, becoming what you feared. Acting out destructively because you can't hold the darkness consciously. This is where affairs happen. Violence erupts, jobs are sabotaged, relationships destroyed. Not from intention, but from unconscious possession by split-off material. Projection, seeing your shadow in everyone else. Suddenly, everyone seems evil, manipulative, dangerous. You're paranoid because you're encountering your own disowned darkness externally rather than recognizing it internally. Self-hatred, identifying entirely with the shadow and believing you are evil. This can lead to self-punishment, self-sabotage, or suicide as self-execution for the crime of being human and flawed. How to integrate it? Active imagination with shadow figures. This is Jung's essential technique. When shadow material emerges, personify it. Imagine it as a figure. It might appear that way in dreams. Dialogue with it. Ask it what it wants, what it's protecting, what it has to teach you. Your rage figure might say, I'm here because you've let people violate your boundaries for decades. I'm your power returning. Your sexual shadow might say, I'm your aliveness that you denied to be good. I'm asking for conscious expression, not repression or acting out. Safe exploration of forbidden desires. This doesn't mean acting on them. It means write about them, draw them, explore them in fantasy or in therapeutic container. Understand what psychological need they're expressing. Recognize shadow as lost vitality. Most shadow qualities, when integrated consciously, become strengths. Your selfish shadow might actually be healthy self-care. Your aggressive shadow might be necessary assertiveness. Your destructive shadow might be capacity to end what needs ending. Compassion for your own darkness. You're human. You contain the full spectrum. Everyone does. The difference is whether you hold it consciously or let it possess you unconsciously. Jung said, "I'd rather be whole than good." This is what he meant. Embrace your totality rather than identifying with only the light. Experience. 4. Prophetic dreams and visions. The unconscious speaks directly. What it feels like. Your dreams become apocalyptic. Every night, cities on fire, oceans swallowing land, buildings crumbling. You dream of your own. Death repeatedly, drowning, falling, being shot, car crashes, disease. Dreams where your body is dismembered, torn apart, eaten, scattered. Or prophetic dreams, dreaming of things that later happen. Dreaming conversations that occur the next day, word for word. Dreaming of death and then hearing someone died. The dreams feel more real than waking life. Then waking visions start, driving and seeing death in the passenger seat, sitting alone and sensing presences, figures, beings, energies that aren't physically there but are undeniably present. Geometric patterns behind closed eyes, faces appearing in darkness, symbols that recur obsessively, archetypal figures, wise old men, dangerous women, children, animals, angels, demons. They don't feel like imagination. They feel autonomous, like they have intelligence independent of your conscious mind. What's actually happening? The unconscious is communicating directly through symbolic language. During the dark night, when rational mind has failed and ego structure is dissolving, the unconscious compensates by speaking in its native language. Symbols, images, archetypal figures. These dreams aren't random. They're showing you the death-rebirth process your psyche is undergoing. Apocalypse dreams are your psychological world ending. Death dreams are your ego dying. Dismemberment dreams are the shamanic pattern of being taken apart so you can be reconstructed. Jung's Red Book is full of these visions. He encountered Salome, representing dangerous feminine power, Philemon, the wise old man, the Red One, serpent-like figure from the underworld. He initially feared psychosis, but he learned these were autonomous complexes, fragments of the collective unconscious taking personified form to communicate with consciousness. The archetypal pattern, shamanic dismemberment, the pattern across cultures where the initiate is torn apart by spirits and reconstructed with new power. Initiatory death dreams, documented in religious traditions worldwide as marks of spiritual calling. The prophetic dream tradition, in Greek mythology, Hebrew scripture, Islamic tradition, where dreams reveal hidden truth or future events. Visitation dreams, where the dead, divine figures or wise beings appear with guidance. The psychological meaning, the unconscious has its own intelligence. When the ego is failing, the unconscious provides compensation through symbols. These dreams and visions are guidance system, roadmaps through the territory you're navigating. Death dreams don't mean you're dying. They mean your ego structure is dying. Dismemberment dreams don't mean you're fragmenting pathologically. They mean you're being psychologically taken apart so new structure can form. Prophetic dreams aren't supernatural, though they feel that way. They're the unconscious processing information the conscious mind hasn't registered yet and presenting it symbolically. The figures appearing, archetypes from the collective. Unconscious are aspects of your own psyche that have gained enough energy to manifest as seemingly autonomous presences. They're not external entities, but they're not exactly you either. They're the unconscious personifying itself, so it can relate to consciousness. The danger points? Literalizing the symbols, believing you're actually dying when you dream of death, believing the archetypal figures are external entities, angels, demons, aliens, rather than internal dynamics. This is where people cross into delusion. The symbols are real psychologically but not literally real, being overwhelmed by the visions. If they're so frequent and intense that you can't function, if you can't distinguish waking from dreaming, if the figures take over and possess you, that's pathological boundary collapse. Inflating around the visions, believing they make you special, chosen, prophetic. The ego can hijack the unconscious material and inflate around it. I'm having visions, therefore I must be enlightened, chosen by God, psychic. This is spiritual inflation, using genuine experience as fuel. How to work with them. Keep a detailed dream journal. Write every dream immediately upon waking. Over time, patterns emerge. Recurring symbols, figures, themes. This is the unconscious showing you its language. Learn symbolic language. Study Jung's work on archetypes, mythology, fairy tales. Not to interpret dreams mechanically, but to understand that symbolic language works differently than literal language. A snake isn't just a snake, it's transformation energy, chthonic power, death, and rebirth. Do active imagination with dream figures. If a terrifying figure appears, don't run. Engage it. Ask, who are you? What do you want? What do you have to teach me? Let it respond in your imagination. Record the dialogue. This creates conscious relationship with unconscious contents rather than being overwhelmed by them. Amplification, Jung's technique for understanding symbols. When a symbol appears repeatedly, water, fire, a particular animal, research its meaning across cultures, mythology, religion. The collective patterns illuminate what your unconscious is communicating. Find an analyst or therapist trained in depth psychology who understands archetypal dreams, not someone who'll reduce them to trauma processing or cognitive distortions, but someone who can help you read them as communications from the self about your transformation. And crucially, ground the visions. If they're so intense you're losing touch with consensus reality, you need grounding practices, possibly medication, possibly temporary cessation of practices that intensify them. Meditation, psychedelics, isolation. The goal is conscious relationship with the unconscious, not being flooded by it. Experience. 5. Synchronicities and reality breakdown. When the veil thins, what it feels like. You think of someone you haven't spoken to in years. Within an hour, they call. This happens repeatedly, not occasionally, constantly. You're struggling with a question. A book falls off the shelf, opens to the exact page that addresses it. You need guidance. A stranger approaches and says exactly what you needed to hear, then disappears. Numbers appear everywhere. 1111 on every clock, license plates, receipts, or a specific symbol appears repeatedly in different contexts, or phrases you just thought appear in the next conversation, the next article, the next song on the radio. Dreams predict events. You dream of a car accident, then witness one the next day. You dream of someone's death, then receive news of their death. The boundary between inner and outer, psyche and matter, prediction and creation becomes permeable. You feel the universe is communicating with you directly, not metaphorically, literally. Reality itself seems conscious, responsive, intelligent. Synchronicities become so frequent and undeniable that your materialist worldview shatters. What's actually happening? Jung's concept of synchronicity, meaningful coincidence that connects inner and outer worlds through meaning rather than mechanical causation, becomes the dominant experience. During the dark night, as ego boundaries dissolve, the normal separation between psyche and world becomes permeable. Jung spent decades studying this, concluding that synchronicities aren't random coincidences misinterpreted through pattern recognition. They're genuine causal connecting principles, moments when the unius mundus, the unified world underlying the apparent separation of psyche and matter, becomes visible. During states of heightened emotional intensity, psychological crisis, or ego dissolution, synchronicities dramatically increase. Why? Several theories. Your unconscious is more active and projecting onto environment. Your perceptual filters are down and you're noticing patterns that were always there. Or Jung's radical proposal, consciousness and matter are more entangled than classical physics assumes, and the psyche actually participates in creating synchronistic events through non-local causation. The archetypal pattern, the magician in tarot, understanding that consciousness affects reality. The world card, the union of inner and outer, above and below. The trickster, reality becoming fluid, playful, refusing to stay in mechanistic boxes. In mythology, the moment when gods intervene directly in human affairs. The burning bush speaking to Moses, the I Ching responding to the question, oracles and divination systems that seem to know the questioner's situation impossibly. The psychological reality, your unconscious is trying to guide you when rational mind has failed. Synchronicities function as navigation system through the dark night. Their breadcrumbs, confirmations, course corrections, appearing through external events because you can't hear inner guidance anymore. The increased synchronicities also serve to break down your rationalist worldview. The ego structure, being dismantled, was built on assumptions. Reality is purely material. Consciousness is generated by brain, self and world are separate. Causation is only mechanical. The dark night challenges all these assumptions. Synchronicities are one way the psyche demonstrates that reality is stranger, more consciousness embedded, more meaningful than your ego believed. This doesn't mean you're creating reality with your thoughts. It means the relationship between consciousness and reality is more participatory, more entangled than the billiard ball model of causation suggests. The danger points, magical thinking, believing you're controlling reality with your mind, believing every random event is a message for you, believing you're the center of a cosmic drama where the universe revolves around your development. This is inflation, the ego hijacking genuine synchronistic experience and turning it into grandiosity, paranoia. If synchronicities can be meaningful connections, how do you know which connections are meaningful and which are random? People in psychotic breaks often experience overwhelming synchronicities that they interpret persecutorily. The universe is sending me messages that people are plotting against me. The paranoid mind sees connections everywhere, but interprets them through fear, loss of agency, waiting for synchronistic signs to tell you what to do rather than taking responsibility for choices, using synchronicity as replacement for discernment, abdicating power to the universe rather than recognizing synchronicity as one information source among many. How to navigate it? Acknowledge synchronicities without inflating. Yes, meaningful coincidences are increasing. Yes, they seem to provide guidance. No, this doesn't mean you're special or chosen or that reality revolves around you. Everyone in ego dissolution experiences this. It's part of the territory, not proof of your uniqueness. Journal them. Keep detailed records of synchronicities with dates, contexts, what question you were holding when they appeared, what meaning they seem to offer. Over time, patterns emerge. You learn to distinguish guidance from noise. Don't make major life decisions based solely on synchronicities. They're one data point, not the only data point. If synchronicities suggest something, sit with it, investigate it practically, but don't treat it as direct orders from the universe. Recognize synchronicities as the unconscious, speaking through world events rather than through dreams. Same source, different language. Ask what the unconscious is trying to communicate, not what magical power you suddenly have. Ground them in practical reality. If a synchronicity suggests move to this city, don't immediately move. Investigate practically. Does this city have job opportunities, housing you can afford? Does this align with your actual life situation, or is it fantasy? Synchronicities can be valid and still require practical grounding, experience. 6. The encounter with death, Thanatos rising. What it feels like. You become obsessed with death. Not in a depressed, I want to die way, though that may also be present, but in a philosophical, spiritual, existential way. Death feels like a presence in your life. You sense it, feel it, think about it constantly. You research death. You read about dying processes, near-death experiences, what happens after death. You think about your own death constantly. What would happen? Who would care? What it would feel like? You might visit cemeteries, go to funerals of people you barely know, or feel drawn to places associated with death. Death appears in your dreams nightly. You dream of dying in countless ways. You dream of being dead, watching your own funeral, existing as a ghost, being in what seems like the afterlife. You wake feeling like you've actually died and are somehow still here. And strangest, you feel like you're dying, even though you're physically healthy. Your body feels like it's shutting down. You go to doctors convinced something is terminally wrong. Tests show nothing, but the feeling of impending death remains. What's actually happening? The ego is dying, not the body, but the ego cannot distinguish symbolic death from literal death. Your consciousness structure, your sense of separate self, your identity, these are undergoing death, and because ego is all you've known, it registers as total death. Jung understood that the second half of life is preparation for death, not morbidly, but developmentally. We must face mortality, integrate it, allow it to reorganize our priorities and values. The dark night forces this preparation consciously. It makes death visible, palpable, impossible to deny. This is also the death drive, what Freud called thanatos, becoming conscious. We contain both life force, eros, and death drive, thanatos. Thanatos isn't suicide wish. It's the drive toward dissolution, return to undifferentiated state, release from the burden of separate selfhood. During the dark night, thanatos becomes visible because the life structure you built is dying and some part of you knows it needs to die. The archetypal pattern, the death card in tarot, not literal death, but transformation through endings. Saturn, the god who devours his children. Time that brings all things to end. The psychopomp figures Charon, Anubis, the Grim Reaper, who guides souls across thresholds. In mythology, descent to the underworld. Orpheus, Inanna, Persephone, Jesus, all descend to death's domain and return transformed. The initiatory death that precedes rebirth. The psychological truth, your old self is dying. The person you were, with their assumptions, identities, defensive structures, way of organizing reality, that person is being killed by the self. You're in the death phase of death rebirth. And your consciousness is experiencing this as literal death, because from the ego's perspective, it is. The obsession with death serves a function. It's forcing you to face the ultimate truth of impermanence, forcing reorganization of priorities around what actually matters when you remember you're mortal, forcing release of attachments to temporary identities. Many people live their entire lives in denial of death. The dark night removes that denial. It makes you conscious of mortality in a way that, paradoxically, allows you to live more fully. Because when you're not running from death, you're no longer running from life. The danger points, suicide. The ego, experiencing its symbolic death, convinces you that physical death is the solution. It can't distinguish metaphorical from literal, so it offers, if we're dying anyway, let's end this suffering by completing the death. This is tragic misunderstanding. Your ego is dying. Your body doesn't need to. Mistaking symbolic for literal, believing you're physically dying when you're not. hypochondria, health anxiety, emergency room visits for symptoms that are psychosomatic manifestations of ego death, spiritual bypassing of real grief, using the "it's just ego death" framework to avoid grieving real losses, relationships ending, dreams dying, versions of yourself being lost. The death is symbolic and it's real. You're losing something that deserves grief. How to work with it. Distinguish ego death from physical death. When the death terror arises, ask, is my body actually dying or is my sense of self dying? Usually, it's the latter. Your body is fine. Your consciousness structure is what's dying. If you're having suicidal thoughts, get support immediately. Tell someone, call a crisis line, see a psychiatrist. The ego's confusion about symbolic versus literal death can be fatal. You need external reality testing. Engage death meditation practices. In Buddhist tradition, contemplating death isn't morbid, it's liberating. Consciously meditate on your mortality. I will die, this body will end. How does that change how I live now? This makes the unconscious death material conscious. Grieve the self you're losing. Your old self is dying. That self had qualities, relationships, dreams. Grieve them. Write a eulogy for who you were. Ritual burning of old identities. This honors the death rather than denying it. Read about symbolic death traditions. Saint John of the Cross, Saint Teresa of Avila. Sufi poetry about annihilation in God. Buddhist teachings on ego death. Seeing that this experience is documented across traditions as transformative rather than pathological helps contextualize your terror. If you're actively suicidal, stop reading and get help now. This is non-negotiable. Call 988 in the US or equivalent crisis line in your country, or go to an emergency room. The rest of this transformation means nothing if you don't survive it. Experience. 7. Mystical experiences and cosmic consciousness, touching the numinous, what it feels like. You're sitting normally and suddenly you're not. Your sense of separate self dissolves, not terrifyingly this time, but expansively. You feel merged with everything. The boundaries between you and world disappear. You experience what mystics call union, not metaphorical union, but felt sense of being one consciousness, experiencing itself through infinite forms, or overwhelming presence of the divine, sacred, numinous, whatever language fits your framework. You feel the presence of God, or cosmic intelligence, or the ground of being, or infinite consciousness, not as concept, but as direct experience. You're being seen, known, held by something infinitely larger than yourself. Energy moves through your body, kundalini activation, chakras opening, light flowing up your spine. Out-of-body experiences where you exist as awareness without physical location. Experiences of infinite love, infinite peace, infinite understanding, or the terrifying version, the numinous as overwhelming, obliterating, too vast to comprehend. The sacred as terror as much as awe. God as infinite power that could destroy you with attention. The cosmos as so large that your separate self is revealed as laughably insignificant. What's actually happening? The self is breaking through the ego's defensive structures. Jung understood the self, the totality of the psyche, including all unconscious contents, as numinous. When you experience it directly, it evokes what Rudolf Otto called mysterium tremendum et fascinans, the mystery that makes you tremble with terror and fascination simultaneously. These mystical experiences aren't random. They're the psyche providing glimpses of what you're becoming, showing you the larger consciousness that exists beyond ego. Their preview of the reorganized psyche that will emerge after ego death completes. Neurologically, the default mode network that creates separate self is temporarily shutting down, allowing experience of consciousness without the self-construct. This is the same mechanism in mystical experiences induced by psychedelics, meditation, or spontaneous spiritual emergency. The archetypal pattern, the mystic union, documented across traditions, Saint Teresa's ecstasy, Rumi's annihilation in the beloved, Buddha under the Bodhi tree, Moses and the burning bush, the moment of direct encounter with ultimate reality, the world card in tarot, cosmic consciousness, the union of all opposites, the hieros gamos, sacred marriage where opposites unite, the unus mundus, Jung's concept of the unified world underlying apparent separation, the psychological interpretation, the self is making itself known. Your ego has been running the show, thinking it's the totality of who you are. These mystical experiences are the self demonstrating. You are so much larger than you thought. This separate self you've been defending is a tiny fragment of what you actually are. This reorganizes the entire psyche. After genuine mystical experience, you can't go back to believing the ego is all you are. You've experienced yourself as cosmic, consciousness, or universal love, or divine presence. Now the task becomes, how do you integrate that into a functional human life? How do you be both infinite and finite, both universal consciousness and embodied particular person? The danger points, spiritual inflation. The ego hijacks the mystical experience. I experienced cosmic consciousness, therefore I'm enlightened. I'm beyond ordinary humans now. I'm special. This is the ego inflating around the experience rather than being transformed by it. Addiction to peak experiences. Chasing more mystical experiences instead of integrating what you've already received. Using meditation, psychedelics, or practices to escape into bliss rather than do the difficult work of embodying insights. Bypassing integration work, believing that because you've touched the numinous, the psychological work is complete. But mystical experience without integration creates spiritual bypassing. Using transcendence to avoid immanence, using unity consciousness to avoid dealing with your actual personality structure, relationships, trauma, misinterpreting through ego. Your ego experienced something the ego cannot contain. Be very careful about the story you tell about what happened. Did you experience yourself as God, or did you experience the self, which is not ego? This distinction matters immensely. How to integrate. Don't tell everyone immediately. The impulse after mystical experience is to share, teach, convert others. Resist this. Sit with the experience. Let it metabolize. What seems like urgent truth to share is often ego inflation disguised as spiritual service. Ground the experience in body and daily life. What changes in how you treat people, how you work, how you relate to suffering? Mystical experience should make you more human, more compassionate, more embodied, not less. Work with a teacher or therapist who understands mystical states, someone who can help you distinguish genuine insight from inflation, integration from bypassing, self from ego hijacking self-experience. Focus on embodying insights rather than collecting experiences. One genuine mystical experience fully integrated can transform your entire life. 1,000 experiences unintegrated are just spiritual entertainment. Recognize that mystical experience is common in dark night, but isn't the end goal. The goal is individuation, becoming whole, authentic, integrated. Mystical experiences serve that process, but they're not the process itself. Experience. 8. The void experience. Confronting absolute emptiness, what it feels like. This is different from the death of meaning. That was everything losing meaning. This is beyond meaning and not meaning. This is void, absolute, featureless, empty void where nothing exists, not even you. You feel nothing, not depression's heaviness, not grief's pain, not anxiety's tension, just nothing, emotional flatness beyond any affect. You're a hollow shell, an empty vessel, a blank space where a person used to be. The world looks empty. Colors are there, but lifeless. People talk, but their words are just sounds. You go through days experiencing total absence, absence of feeling, meaning, connection, presence, existence itself. You pray and there's silence. You meditate and there's nothing. You reach for anything, joy, pain, love, fear, and encounter only void. You feel erased, invisible to yourself, existing without existing, and the terrifying part, this can last for months, long stretches where there's just nothing. The mystics call this dark night proper, the silence of God, the absence of presence, the void that contains no comfort, no sign, no hope. What's actually happening? The nigredo phase. In alchemical terms, the blackening. All previous structures have been dissolved. The old self is completely dead, but the new self hasn't formed yet. You're in the gap, the terrible gap between deaths and births. This is the fertile void, the pregnant darkness before creation, the womb space where transformation gestates. But the ego experiences it as annihilation because the ego needs content, stimulus, something to do. The void offers none of this. Jung understood this as the most dangerous and most necessary phase. Dangerous because people often give up here, believing this emptiness is permanent. Necessary because authentic self can only emerge from this groundlessness, not from ego trying to create something new, but from the void spontaneously giving birth to what's authentic. The archetypal pattern, the dark night proper as St. John of the Cross described, the silence of God, the absence of all consolation, the hermit card in complete darkness, alone with nothing, the nigredo blackening in alchemy where the prima materia is reduced to formless darkness, the desert in spiritual traditions, 40 days in wilderness, years of wandering, time of testing through absolute emptiness. The underworld in mythology, Persephone's time in Hades, the dead realm where nothing grows. The psychological process. Your psyche has completed the destruction phase. The false self is gone. All borrowed meaning, all defensive structures, all ego identifications, demolished. What remains is nothing, and that nothing is terrifying because it has no landmarks, no content, no guidance. But this void is threshold, not tomb. It's the space between who you were and who you're becoming. Creation happens from emptiness. Authentic being emerges from no-thingness. But you have to tolerate the void long enough for spontaneous emergence rather than ego forcing new identity. The void teaches, you are not what you think, not what you feel, not what you do, not your roles, not your history. You are the awareness that remains when all content disappears. But that awareness from the ego's perspective feels like nothing. The danger points, mistaking void for final destination, believing this emptiness is all there is, that you'll feel nothing forever, that transformation was promised but won't come. This can lead to suicide, not from pain but from the unbearable weight of permanent emptiness, using substances to feel anything, alcohol, drugs, self-harm, extreme experiences, attempting to generate sensation because sensation at least proves you exist. This interrupts the process the void is serving, giving up one day too soon. The void can last so long that you lose faith that anything will ever emerge from it. People who've navigated this successfully often report, I was about to give up, and that's when the first light appeared. But people who gave up never know how close they were to breakthrough, how to navigate, recognize void as threshold, not tomb. This is temporary. It's a stage, not a permanent state. Every documented account of dark night includes void phase, and everyone includes emergence from void. Trust the pattern even when you can't feel hope. Practice void meditation. Instead of trying to fill the emptiness, consciously be with it. Sit in the nothing. Let yourself experience the full weight of absence without distracting, medicating, or stimulating. This sounds unbearable, but it's actually training, learning to rest in groundlessness. Minimal structure maintenance. You can't function normally during void phase. Don't expect to, but maintain bare minimum: food, sleep, hygiene, one tiny task per day that keeps you connected to physical reality, not to prove you're not okay, but to maintain thread of connection so you can find your way back when emergence happens. Trust that creation comes from emptiness. Every spiritual tradition teaches this. The void is fertile. Silence contains all sound. Darkness contains all light. This isn't spiritual bypassing, it's ontological truth. What feels like nothing is actually no thing, pure potentiality before manifestation. If you're in month 6 of void and losing will to continue, tell someone. Get support not to fix the void, but to have witness who can remind you, this is a stage. Others have survived it. You can too. Experience. 9. The call to solitude. Hermit imperative. What it feels like. You cannot be around people, not because you're depressed or antisocial, but because social interaction requires a kind of energy and performance you no longer have access to. Small talk feels like violence. Being in groups feels like wearing sandpaper clothes. Even people you love feel intrusive. You cancel plans obsessively. You stop answering texts. You fantasize about disappearing, moving to a cabin, a monastery, another country, anywhere you can be completely alone. Not to escape people you dislike, but to escape all people, all social demands, all performance requirements. You need days, weeks alone. Silence becomes sacred. Solitude becomes the only space where you can breathe. You're not isolating in the depressed sense of wanting to hide. You're hermiting in the sacred sense of needing protected space for internal transformation. You might actually leave, quit your job, end relationships, move. Or you might stay physically but withdraw emotionally, becoming the hermit within your existing life. What's actually happening? Your psyche needs protected space away from social demands because you can't simultaneously undergo ego death and maintain social persona. The mask is gone. The role performer is dead. You literally cannot be the person others expect you to be anymore because that person doesn't exist. Jung withdrew significantly during his confrontation with the unconscious. He couldn't see patients full-time. He built Bullingen Tower as hermitage space. He needed solitude for the internal work. Active imagination, integrating unconscious contents, allowing new structure to form without interference from collective expectations. This is archetypal hermitage, the necessary withdrawal that allows transformation. Every hero's journey includes this: time in the cave, the wilderness, the underworld. Separate from tribe, away from familiar identity, alone with the mystery that's unfolding. The archetypal pattern, the hermit card, alone on the mountain with only a lantern, withdrawn from world to seek wisdom. The monk, mystic, ascetic archetype, withdrawal from society for spiritual development. The vision quest, going alone into wilderness for days until vision comes. In mythology, Buddha under the Bodhi tree, Jesus in the desert 40 days, shaman's isolation during initiation. The archetypal pattern of sacred solitude is necessary for transformation. The psychological necessity. You can't rebuild yourself while performing for others. Ego death requires space where you don't have to be anyone in particular, where you can fall apart without managing others' reactions, where you can be with the terror, the void, the visions without maintaining functional adult facade. Social interaction, even loving interaction, requires ego functions that are temporarily offline during the dark night. You need to conserve energy for the internal work. The hermitage isn't avoidance, it's focus. And there's this: Other people carry the collective's expectations. When you're around them, you feel pressure to be who you were, to get better, to return to normal. Their presence, however loving, pulls you toward premature reconstruction rather than allowing complete dissolution. The danger points: pathological isolation, using hermitage as defense mechanism rather than sacred space, cutting off all support, all connection, all grounding in relationship. Humans are relational beings. We need some connection even during hermitage. Complete isolation increases risk of psychosis, depression, and suicide. Hermit as permanent identity, getting stuck in withdrawal, making it your new role. Some people enter dark night hermitage and never emerge because the inner world feels safer than the outer world. But transformation requires eventual return, bringing what you've learned back to human community, using solitude to avoid necessary relationships. If there are relationships you need to address, conflicts you need to resolve, intimacy you need to develop, withdrawal can become avoidance disguised as spirituality, mistaking hermitage for the goal. The goal isn't becoming a hermit, it's using solitude as container for transformation, then returning with new capacity for authentic relationship. How to work with it: honor the call while maintaining minimal connection. Yes, withdraw. Yes, create protected space, but maintain thread of connection to at least one person: therapist, friend, spiritual director, someone who can witness your process without demanding you be functional. Set time boundaries. I'm taking 6 months of hermitage is different from I'm disappearing forever. Defining boundaries helps both you and others understand this is temporary, even if it doesn't feel temporary. Distinguish healing solitude from defensive isolation. Healing solitude: you're doing internal work, engaging with unconscious material, undergoing transformation, even though it's invisible to others. Defensive isolation: you're avoiding, dissociating, using aloneness to escape rather than transform. Find analyst or guide to witness remotely. Jung emphasized the importance of someone witnessing the process, even if they can't be physically present often. Someone who understands this as transformation rather than pathology, who can provide minimal grounding without invading your hermitage. Trust that you'll know when it's time to return. The hermitage has its own timing. You'll feel when the internal work has reached a point where re-engagement with world is necessary. Don't force premature return, but don't refuse the call when it comes. Experience 10: dismemberment and reconstruction, the alchemical process. What it feels like. You feel like you're being torn apart, not metaphorically, but as felt sense in your body and psyche. Different parts of you seem to fragment, conflict, separate. You lose integrated sense of self. One day you're one person, the next day a completely different person. You don't recognize continuity in yourself across time. Your identity feels scattered. Who you are at work, who you are with family, who you are alone, they don't connect. They're separate selves that don't know each other. You experience yourself as a collection of fragments rather than coherent whole. Dreams of being cut apart, eaten, dismembered, scattered. Dreams where your body parts are separated and later reassembled but differently. Waking sense that something is taking you apart piece by piece to rebuild you in new configuration. Then gradually, moments where new coherence emerges. Unfamiliar sense of self that doesn't match old identity but feels more real. Parts reassembling but around different center of gravity. New structure forming, but it's not the old structure reconstructed. It's fundamentally different architecture. What's actually happening? This is the solve et coagula of alchemy. Dissolve and recombine. The self is dismantling the entire psychic system that was organized around ego as false center and reconstructing it around self as authentic center. Shamanic initiation across cultures involves literal dismemberment dreams, Spirits tear the initiate apart, remove old organs, replace them with crystals or power objects, reassemble the body with new capacity. Jung understood this as psychological reality. The old psychic structure must be completely dismantled. Then the psyche spontaneously reorganizes around the self rather than ego. What you're experiencing as fragmentation is actually the transition state. The old, integrated structure is gone. New structure hasn't fully formed yet. In between, there are pieces, parts, fragments that haven't yet found their new relationship to each other. The archetypal pattern: Osiris dismembered by Set, scattered across Egypt, then gathered and reconstructed by Isis, the phoenix burning to ash and rising reborn, the shamanic dismemberment where the initiate is torn apart by spirits and reconstructed with new power. Solvet coagula in alchemy: the substance must be dissolved completely before it can be recombined in higher form. Death and rebirth as literal process, not metaphor. The psychological reality: your entire psyche is reorganizing. The ego was the organizing principle. Everything related to it, served it, defended it. Now the self is becoming the organizing principle. But this requires taking everything apart and rebuilding from new foundation. Imagine you built a house with the front door as center. Then you realize the center should be somewhere else. You can't just move the center. You have to dismantle the entire house and rebuild it with new architecture. That's what's happening to your psyche. The fragments you're experiencing are complexes, sub-personalities, parts of self that were organized around ego. Now they're free-floating, waiting to discover their new relationship to the self as center. This is terrifying because you experience yourself as having no center, no continuity, no stable identity. But it's temporary. The new structure is forming even though you can't see it yet. The danger points: dissociative fragmentation that doesn't reintegrate. If parts split off completely and lose communication with each other, you develop dissociative identity disorder or severe dissociation. The difference between transformative dismemberment and pathological dissociation is: will the parts eventually reintegrate around new center, or will they remain split and amnesic? Stopping the process mid-dismemberment. Trying to force the pieces back into old configuration because fragmentation is too terrifying. This creates unstable personality structure. You haven't completed the transformation, but you've damaged the old structure, so you're stuck in liminal state, getting lost in parts work without vision of wholeness. Some therapeutic modalities work extensively with parts, IFS, ego state therapy. These can be helpful, but risk is identifying so strongly with separate parts that you lose connection to integrating center. How to support the process. Parts work: internal family systems therapy. Since you're experiencing yourself as parts, work directly with them. Learn to identify each part, understand its function, its history, its needs. Create internal dialogue between parts. Eventually, they can find new relationship to each other around self as center. Active imagination with fragments. When you notice a part that feels separate, personify it. Give it a voice. Dialogue with it. Who are you? What do you need? What's your relationship to the whole? Let it teach you about the reorganization happening. Somatic therapy to ground the process in body. Dismemberment happens in psyche but affects soma. Body-based practices help parts remember they're all part of one body, one organism. This provides grounding when psychological continuity is lost. Trustworthy therapeutic container. You need someone witnessing who can hold the vision of your wholeness even when you can't feel it. Someone who's seen this process complete in others and can remind you, you're not fragmenting permanently. You're being reconstructed. Patience with non-linear process. Reconstruction doesn't happen smoothly. You'll have days where new integration feels solid, then days where you're scattered again. This is normal. The new structure forms through cycles of coherence and dissolution until it stabilizes. Recognize the phoenix pattern. You're not being destroyed. You're being reconstructed. The ashes contain everything necessary for the rebirth. Trust that the psyche has intelligence guiding this process, even when it feels like chaos. These 10 experiences are the map. Not everyone experiences all 10. Some people cycle through certain ones repeatedly. They don't happen in strict order, but together they define the territory of the dark night of the soul. If you recognize yourself in multiple experiences, understand, you're not crazy. You're undergoing the most profound transformation available to human consciousness. The process is dangerous, yes. It can destroy you if navigated unconsciously, but it can also birth you into authenticity you never imagined possible. The question is, what are the catastrophic outcomes if this goes wrong? And how do you avoid them while allowing the transformation to complete? Let me show you the 5 ways this journey ends in tragedy, and how to recognize the warning signs before it's too late. The dark night of the soul is not metaphor. It's not spiritual poetry. It's a psychological crisis as dangerous as any medical emergency. People die. People go permanently insane. People destroy their lives irreparably. The difference between transformation and catastrophe isn't the intensity of the experience. It's consciousness, support, and timing. Let me show you the 5 ways this goes catastrophically wrong. Danger 1. Psychotic break and permanent dissociation. What it looks like. Ego dissolution goes too far. The boundaries between self and world, inner and outer, symbolic and literal, completely collapse. Reality testing fails. You can't distinguish your thoughts from external events. You can't tell if the voices you're hearing are internal dialogue or external entities. You believe you're Jesus or the Antichrist, or that the CIA is tracking you, or that demons are possessing you. Your family finds you talking to people who aren't there, performing bizarre rituals, unable to recognize loved ones, completely lost in a symbolic world that's become literal reality for you. You're hospitalized, diagnosed with schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder, medicated with antipsychotics. Sometimes the medication brings you back, sometimes it doesn't, or the dissociation becomes permanent. You experience chronic depersonalization, always watching yourself from outside, never fully in your body, never fully real. Or dissociative identity disorder, parts fragment completely and develop amnesia for each other, switching between different identities with no continuity, no integration, no center holding it together. Real cases. Jung documented patients who entered the confrontation with the unconscious and never returned. One woman began having visions of archetypal figures, became convinced she was the Virgin Mary reincarnated, and spent the rest of her life in an institution, unable to function, completely possessed by the archetype she'd encountered. A contemporary case. Michael, a 38-year-old software engineer, began intensive meditation practice. Within 3 months, he experienced spontaneous Kundalini awakening, followed by ego dissolution. Without proper container or guidance, he interpreted the experiences through paranoid framework. The energy was demons attacking him. The synchronicities were evidence of surveillance. The voice of the self speaking through active imagination was an external entity commanding him. He quit his job, abandoned his apartment, started living on the streets, following divine guidance. When police found him 6 months later, he was catatonic, non-responsive, completely lost in internal symbolic world. Diagnosis: acute psychotic episode with dissociative features. 3 years later, on medication, he's marginally functional but will never fully return to the consciousness he had before. The door opened too wide, too fast, and he fell through. The mechanism. The ego serves essential function. It maintains boundaries between self and world. It filters sensory input. It creates narrative continuity across time. It distinguishes symbolic from literal. During the dark night, these functions temporarily weaken. That's necessary for transformation. But if they collapse entirely without any containing structure, consciousness fragments in ways that don't spontaneously reintegrate. The difference between transformative ego dissolution and psychotic break is, can you maintain the observing self? Can some part of you witness what's happening and know, I'm having visions, rather than, these visions are literal reality? Can you hold symbolic awareness? The self is speaking through this inner voice, rather than, God is literally commanding me. If you can't, if symbolic becomes literal, if inner becomes outer, if self becomes God commanding me externally, you've crossed into psychosis, and crossing back is not guaranteed. Warning signs before the break: complete loss of interest in physical reality, not eating, not sleeping, not attending to body, inability to distinguish thoughts from external events, believing you're historical or religious figure, hearing external voices that others don't hear and believing they're literally real, paranoid beliefs that people are plotting against you, tracking you, trying to harm you. Complete loss of social functioning. Can't work, can't maintain relationships, can't perform basic tasks. Beliefs that you have special powers or mission that conflicts with reality. Others telling you they're scared of you or you're not making sense and you can't understand why. Prevention. If you recognize these signs in yourself, you need immediate psychiatric intervention. This is not weakness. This is survival. The ego has dissolved too far, too fast. You need medication to strengthen boundaries temporarily while you build psychological container. You need hospitalization if you can't maintain safety. The tragedy is people refuse help during the pre-psychotic phase because they interpret the dissolution as spiritual awakening. I don't need medication, I'm enlightening. But enlightenment maintains functionality. Enlightenment doesn't make you homeless, paranoid, and unable to feed yourself. That's not awakening. That's breakdown. Danger 2. Suicide during the void phase. What it looks like. You're in month 6 of the void. Nothing has meaning. Nothing will ever have meaning. You've lost faith that transformation is coming. You've forgotten what it feels like to feel anything. And the ego, experiencing its symbolic death, convinces you, if we're dying anyway, let's end it. Physical death would be mercy compared to this endless psychological death. You're not suicidal from depression. You're not even depressed. You're suicidal from emptiness, from the unbearable weight of continuing to exist when existence has no content, no purpose, no feeling, from exhaustion at maintaining a body when there's no one home inside it. You make plans, detailed, rational plans. You're not impulsive or emotional about it. You've simply concluded logically that non-existence is preferable to this void existence. You might write notes explaining that you're not sick, not broken, just done. You've given it time. Nothing is coming. This is the reasonable choice. Real cases. David Foster Wallace. Brilliant writer, profound. Thinker, someone who understood the dark night intellectually, but understanding doesn't equal surviving. His suicide note was rational, calm, explaining that he'd tried everything, that the suffering had no end, that he needed to stop. The Void 1. A less famous case, Sarah, documented in transpersonal psychology literature, 41 years old, therapist herself, undergoing spontaneous spiritual emergency. She navigated the first 8 months with support, therapy, practice, then entered the void. 3 months of absolute nothing. She wrote in her journal, I understand this is supposed to be a stage. I understand birth comes from emptiness, but I can't bear one more day of this. I'm not depressed. I'm erased. And I choose to complete the erasure consciously, rather than endure it indefinitely. She survived only because her therapist, reading desperation in her tone during a phone session, called emergency services, hospitalization, medication, intensive support. She emerged 6 months later, transformation completed. She says now, I was one day from ending it when the first light appeared. One day, if I'd acted on my plan, I would have missed everything that came after. The mechanism, the void phase, is when suicide risk is highest because the ego is experiencing death without resurrection. Meaning has died but hasn't been reborn. Identity has dissolved but hasn't reformed. The ego cannot hold "this is temporary" when there's no evidence that anything will change. Time in the void distorts. 1 week feels like eternity. The ego loses capacity to believe in future because present is so absolutely empty. And here's the cruel trick. Suicide during the dark night often comes not from despair, but from what feels like clarity. I see now that existence is meaningless. Death is simply returning to the void I'm already experiencing. Why maintain this charade of being alive? This is the ego's final defense. If I can't control the transformation, I'll control the death. But it's catastrophic misunderstanding. The symbolic death of the ego doesn't require physical death of the body. They're separate processes confused by consciousness that can't distinguish symbolic from literal. Warning signs: giving away possessions, sudden calm after extended agitation, the calm of having made decision, researching methods, saying goodbye in subtle ways, expressing that you've tried everything and nothing is working, feeling relief at the idea of death. Rational, logical justifications for why ending life makes sense. Statements like, I'm not suicidal, I just don't want to exist anymore. Exhaustion at the prospect of continuing prevention. Tell someone immediately. If you're having suicidal thoughts during the dark night, you need emergency intervention. Not because you're crazy, but because your ego can't distinguish symbolic death from literal death while in the void. Psychiatric hospitalization during void phase saves lives. The hospital provides external structure when internal structure has completely dissolved. Medication can take the edge off the void's intensity without aborting the transformation completely. You're buying time for the process to complete. Create what Jung called temenos, sacred container. If you're not actively endangering yourself, but you're in the danger zone, create structure, daily check-ins with therapist or friend, medication to manage acute suffering, commitment to wait a specific amount of time, 30 days, 90 days, before making any irreversible decisions. Remember, every documented account of successfully navigated dark night includes void phase, and everyone includes emergence from void. The pattern is consistent. You're not exception, but you have to survive long enough to complete the pattern. Call 988 in the US, 116-123 in the UK, or your country's crisis line immediately if you're in danger. This is not negotiable. Danger 3, spiritual inflation and messianic delusion. What it looks like: you've had mystical experiences, you've touched cosmic consciousness, experienced unity with all things, encountered what feels like divine presence, and your ego hijacks it. I've experienced what others haven't. I'm enlightened. I'm awakened. I'm chosen for special mission. I'm here to save people, lead them, teach them. You start gathering followers, creating teachings, positioning yourself as guru or spiritual authority. You believe you've transcended ordinary human limits. Rules don't apply to you anymore. Ethics don't apply. You're operating from higher consciousness now. Money, sex, power, these aren't temptations because you're beyond temptation. You interpret every synchronicity as confirmation of your special status. You surround yourself with people who reflect your grandiosity back to you. You cut off anyone who questions you. You believe your Messiah or Buddha returned, or Christ consciousness incarnate, or the chosen one who will usher in new age. Real cases, too many to count. Every cult leader is a case study in spiritual inflation. Jim Jones, David Koresh, Marshall Applewhite, contemporary figures who won't be named because they're still gathering followers and destroying lives. But also subtler cases. The yoga teacher who had genuine awakening experience, then convinced herself she'd transcended karma and started sleeping with students to help their kundalini activation. The meditation teacher who experienced ego death and emerged believing he was immune to anger, then verbally abused students who challenged him while insisting he was teaching them through compassionate wrath. A documented case from Jungian literature. Thomas, successful businessman who entered dark night after near-death experience, navigated it initially with therapy and practice, had profound mystical experiences of unity consciousness. Then the ego inflated around them. He left his family, quit his job, moved to spiritual community where he positioned himself as awakened teacher. Within 2 years, sexual misconduct with vulnerable followers, financial exploitation, grandiose claims of being vehicle for divine consciousness. His former therapist noted his mystical experiences were genuine. His psychological interpretation of them was catastrophic. He confused self with ego, confused touching the numinous with being the numinous. The mechanism. Mystical experiences during dark night are encounters with the self, the totality that's infinitely larger than ego. But the ego, which has just undergone death and is rebuilding, can hijack these experiences. Instead of recognizing I experience the self, which is not me, the ego thinks I am that, I am God, I am special. This is inflation. The ego expanding to identify with archetypal contents. Jung warned this was as dangerous as ego dissolution. Inflated ego believes it's transcended human limits, when actually it's just possessed by unconscious contents. It's mistaking for its own achievement. The dark night often triggers inflation because the ego, after being demolished, is vulnerable and desperate to rebuild. If it rebuilds by identifying with the mystical experiences rather than integrating them humbly, it creates grandiose structure that's even more false than the original ego. Warning signs: believing you're enlightened, awakened, or permanently beyond suffering. Positioning yourself as teacher before you've fully integrated your own process. Believing rules as ethics don't apply to you because you're operating from higher consciousness. Inability to accept criticism or feedback, interpreted as others' lack of understanding. Gathering followers or students who mirror your specialness back to you. Using spiritual language to justify harmful behavior. Believing synchronicities are signs of your chosen status rather than universal phenomena. Comparing yourself to Christ, Buddha, great spiritual masters. Feeling contempt for unawakened people. Prevention: maintain healthy skepticism about your own experiences. Yes, mystical experiences are real. No, they don't make you special. Millions of people have them. They're part of human developmental process, not evidence of unique status. Find teacher or therapist who will call out inflation. You need someone who's unimpressed by mystical experiences, who will ask hard questions. How has this changed how you treat your family, your co-workers, the cashier at the grocery store? Are you more humble or more grandiose, more compassionate or more superior? Wait years before teaching. Jung's rule: don't teach what you haven't fully integrated. If you've just emerged from dark night, you're still integrating. Give it 5 years minimum of embodiment before assuming you have wisdom to offer others. Study spiritual inflation in others. Read about fallen gurus, cult leaders, inflated teachers. See the pattern. Notice how it starts with genuine experience that gets hijacked by ego. Use their mistakes as warning about your own potential. Remember, genuine enlightenment makes you more human, more humble, more aware of your limitations. Inflation makes you grandiose, special above others. If you feel superior, you're inflated, not awakened. Danger. 4. Suppression leading to worse crisis. What it looks like. The dark night begins. Terror, dissolution, shadow eruption, void, and you panic. You medicate immediately with antidepressants, anxiolytics, anything to stop the experience. You throw yourself into work obsessively. You start new relationship to distract from the dissolution. You use alcohol, drugs, sex, food, exercise to numb the process. It works temporarily. The symptoms subside. You stabilize. Everyone's relieved. You're better. Back to normal. Crisis averted. But 6 months later, or 2 years later, or 10 years later, it returns. Worse, more violent, more uncontrollable. Because you didn't complete the process. You aborted it. The unconscious contents didn't disappear. They went deeper. They accumulated more energy. And now they're erupting with force that can't be suppressed. Or it doesn't return as psychological crisis. It manifests as cancer, autoimmune disease, chronic pain, mysterious illness that no doctor can diagnose or treat. The psyche, unable to transform through psychological death, initiates physical breakdown instead. Real cases. Jung documented multiple patients who suppressed their midlife crises, the typical onset point for dark night, only to develop serious physical illnesses within years. One man, facing the dark night at 45, threw himself into career advancement instead. By 50, he had stomach cancer. Jung's controversial interpretation, the unlived life, the untransformed psyche, manifested as physical destruction. Contemporary case, Rebecca, high-achieving academic. At 39, spontaneous spiritual emergency began, classic dark night symptoms. She immediately sought psychiatric intervention, was prescribed multiple medications, increased work hours to maintain normalcy, refused to acknowledge anything psychological was happening. I have a chemical imbalance that's being treated. The symptoms subsided. She was functional, successful, stable for 8 years. Then at 47, complete breakdown. Psychotic episode, hospitalization, inability to work for a year. Her psychiatrist noted, it's as if everything suppressed in her 30s erupted with compound interest in her late 40s. What could have been navigated over 2 years took 5 years to integrate, because suppression created additional trauma and resistance. The mechanism, the dark night, is initiated by the self-demanding recognition. It's not random crisis, it's purposeful disintegration, serving transformation. When you suppress it, you're telling the self, no, not now, not this way, be quiet. The self doesn't disappear. It doesn't abandon the transformation it initiated. It waits, it grows stronger, and when it erupts again, it must break through not only the original ego structure, but also all the defenses you built to suppress the first initiation, or it finds other pathways. Psyche and soma are one system. What can't transform psychologically often manifests somatically. This isn't metaphysical mysticism, it's psychoneuroimmunology. Suppressed psychological contents affect immune system, inflammatory processes, cellular function. Jung's radical claim, some physical illnesses are the psyche's last-ditch attempt at transformation when all psychological avenues have been blocked. Warning signs you're suppressing rather than integrating, using medication purely to eliminate symptoms without any psychological work, increasing work, busyness to avoid internal experience, starting new relationships or projects immediately after crisis begins, refusing to acknowledge any psychological, spiritual dimension to your suffering, believing that return to normal functioning means you're cured, avoiding anything that might trigger the experiences again, meditation, solitude, depth work, sense of dodged a bullet rather than transformed through fire. Others celebrating your return to normal while you feel vaguely dead inside. Prevention. Medication can be appropriate support, but not as sole intervention. If you need medication to take edge off acute suffering, take it, but also engage in psychological work, therapy, active imagination, dream work, shadow integration. Medication should support transformation, not abort it. Don't rush back to normal. If the dark night has begun, you can't return to who you were. Attempting to do so creates splitting, functional facade with suppressed chaos beneath. That's unstable structure that will eventually collapse. Work with practitioners who understand this as transformation, not just illness. Psychiatrist who prescribes medication and refers you to depth psychologist for the work. Therapist who helps you navigate rather than just stabilize. Accept that this will take years, not weeks or months, years. The dark night is not acute crisis to be quickly resolved. It's developmental process requiring time, patience, and commitment to completing what's been initiated. If you must suppress temporarily for survival reasons, you'll lose job, can't care for children, no support. Acknowledge that you're postponing, not avoiding. Plan to complete the process when container allows. Danger. 5. Dark night as permanent identity. What it looks like. You've been in the dark night for 3 years, 5 years, 8 years. It's become who you are. You're the person going through spiritual crisis. You're the wounded healer who's still wounded. You identify with suffering, with depth, with darkness. It's become your personality, your story, your role in relationships. People ask how you are, still in the dark night, still processing, still in the void. You've read everything, tried everything, talk about it endlessly, but you never complete it, because completing it would mean losing this identity. And this identity, however, painful, is familiar. It's safe in its own way. You might even teach about the dark night while still being in it, never moving through it. You gather others who are suffering and create community around shared pain rather than shared transformation. The dark night becomes permanent feature of your landscape rather than temporary passage. Real cases. Jung warned about patients who became attached to their analysis, their illness, their woundedness. They'd been in therapy for a decade, understood their psychodynamics intellectually, could articulate their shadow and complex structures, but never actually transformed. Why? Because being the patient working on themselves was safer than being a whole person responsible for their life. A case from contemporary practice. David, different from our earlier David, 52 years old, has been in the dark night for 12 years. He's tried every practice, seen multiple therapists, been to retreats, read every book. He speaks eloquently about dissolution, void, shadow work, but he's never held a job for more than 6 months in 12 years, never maintained a relationship, lives off disability. His entire life has organized around being in crisis. His current therapist's assessment. The dark night became his identity around year 3. Everything after that has been maintaining that identity rather than completing the transformation. He's terrified of wholeness because wholeness would mean responsibility, vulnerability, the risk of building a life that could collapse again. The dark night, ironically, became his safe place. The mechanism, the wounded healer archetype, can become trap. Yes, those who've suffered deeply can help others, but the archetype requires completing the wound to healing journey, not remaining permanently wounded. The dark night is supposed to be threshold, not destination, but thresholds can become comfortable. You're not in the old life, which was false, and not yet in the new life, which is unknown and terrifying. The liminal space, the between place, becomes home. Why? Several reasons. The dark night gives you identity when you've lost all other identities. It gives you community with others who understand depth and suffering. It gives you excuse for not building life. I can't work, commit, create because I'm in spiritual crisis. It protects you from the vulnerability of wholeness. If you're broken, you can't be broken again. And there's this. Some people discover they have power, attention, or status as the one going through profound transformation that they wouldn't have as regular person living regular life. The dark night becomes performance, identity, brand, warning signs, years passing without movement or change. Talking about the process more than actually doing the inner work. Your identity completely organized around being in crisis, transformation, resistance to practices or interventions that might actually complete the process, surrounding yourself with others in perpetual crisis rather than those who've transformed, using "I'm in the dark night" as explanation for not working, not committing, not building life. Subtle satisfaction or superiority about your depth, suffering compared to surface people. Fear that emerges when you consider what life would look like if you actually completed this teaching or helping others with dark night while avoiding your own completion, prevention, set time boundaries. I'm giving this process 3 years of dedicated work. If I'm not seeing movement toward integration by then, I'm changing approach. This creates healthy urgency rather than endless dwelling. Track concrete changes, not just psychological insights. Are you more functional, more capable of relationship, more able to work, create, contribute? If you understand the process intellectually, but nothing's changing behaviorally, you're stuck in knowing about rather than transforming through. Find guide who will challenge stuckness, not someone who will endlessly validate your process, but someone who will ask hard questions. What are you avoiding by staying here? What would completion require that you're not willing to do? How is this serving you? Distinguish genuine patience from hidden refusal. Yes, transformation takes time, years even, but there should be movement, cycles of dissolution and emergence, deepening understanding, gradual increase in functionality and integration. If there's no movement, you're refusing completion, not patiently allowing it. Consider that fear of wholeness might be the final barrier. The ego can use the dark night itself as defense against the self. I'm too broken, in process, or still transforming to actually live, is ego's way of avoiding the terror of being whole, responsible, and vulnerable to life again. The brutal truth, at some point, you have to choose. Continue dwelling in the process as identity, or complete the process and face the vulnerability of being whole. The dark night is initiation, not destination. These 5 dangers are real. People are lost to them, not occasionally, regularly. The dark night kills people through suicide, destroys people through psychosis, inflates people into grandiose delusion, suppresses in people until it manifests as illness, or becomes permanent identity that prevents completion. But, and this is essential, these dangers are not inevitable. They're what happens when the dark night is navigated unconsciously, without support, without understanding, or with misguided approaches. Jung survived. Many of his patients survived. Countless mystics, shamans, and ordinary people throughout history have survived and been transformed by this process. The difference between catastrophic outcome and transformative outcome is, do you have a map? Do you have practices? Do you have support? Do you understand what's happening well enough to work with it rather than being destroyed by it? Let me show you Jung's navigation system, the specific blueprint he developed through his own survival and decades of clinical work, the method that allows conscious death and rebirth rather than unconscious destruction. Jung's solution to the dark night wasn't to prevent it, medicate it away, or transcend it through spiritual bypassing. His solution was to navigate it consciously, to provide psychological container strong enough to hold the transformation without being destroyed by it. This isn't theoretical. This is the system Jung developed to save his own life during his confrontation with the unconscious, refined through 40 years of guiding patients through similar territory. It's not guaranteed. Some people are too fragile, some crises too severe, some timing too wrong. But for those who can engage it, this blueprint is the difference between transformation and catastrophe. Step 1. Establish external container. The principle: you cannot navigate ego death alone. The ego that's dying cannot also be the container holding the process. You need external structure, people, places, practices that remain stable while your internal world dissolves. What this looks like: find analyst, therapist, or guide who understands this as transformation rather than only pathology. Not someone who will immediately medicate away all symptoms. Not someone who will romantically encourage you to surrender to the process without assessing danger. Someone who can hold both. This is potentially transformative and potentially dangerous, requiring skilled navigation. Jungian analyst is ideal because they're trained in this territory, but good depth psychologist, transpersonal therapist, or spiritual director with psychological training can also serve. The essential quality: they've either been through this themselves or witnessed many others navigate it, so they know the difference between transformation signs and danger signs. Create minimal life structure. You can't maintain normal functionality during ego death. Accept this, but create bare minimum: safe place to live, enough money to survive, savings, disability, family support, one person checking on you regularly, basic health monitoring. Jung maintained his clinical work during his Red Book years specifically because it kept him grounded. Seeing patients a few hours per week forced him to maintain some ego functioning even while exploring the unconscious the rest of the time. That tether to external reality was essential. Distinguish danger signs from transformation signs. Transformation: you're experiencing ego dissolution but can describe it, can maintain some witness perspective, can function minimally, still eat, sleep, maintain basic hygiene. Danger: you've lost all witness perspective. Believe symbolic content is literally real, can't function at all, actively suicidal or psychotic, no one can reach you. If you're in danger territory, you need hospitalization or intensive intervention. If you're in transformation territory, you need skilled guidance and container, not emergency. Suppression: Jung's key insight: the temenos, sacred container, must be strong enough to hold chaos without collapsing, but permeable enough to allow transformation. Too rigid, forced hospitalization, heavy medication, suppression aborts the process. Too loose, complete isolation, no support, no reality testing, leads to psychosis. The container must be Goldilocks zone, structured but flexible. Step 2. Active imagination as lifeline. The principle: active imagination is Jung's core technique for consciously relating to unconscious contents rather than being overwhelmed by them. It's the practice that saved his life and the method he taught every patient navigating similar territory. What it is: active imagination is dialoguing with figures, images, or forces from the unconscious while maintaining ego consciousness. You're not meditating, which dissolves ego. You're not analyzing, which stays purely in ego. You're creating bridge between ego and unconscious where both can communicate. How to practice: enter relaxed but alert state. Sit comfortably, close eyes, breathe. But don't try to empty mind or dissolve self. Stay present as you. Invite what wants to emerge. If a figure has appeared in dreams or visions, call it forth. If you're feeling overwhelming emotion, let it take shape. If you sense a presence, ask it to reveal itself. The unconscious will personify, will appear as figure, image, symbol. Engage it directly. Don't just observe. Speak to it, aloud or internally. Ask, Who are you? What do you want? What do you have to teach me? And crucially, wait for response. Let the figure answer in its own voice, not in your conscious voice. Distinguish genuine encounter from imagination. How do you know it's real, active imagination versus just making things up? The figure says things you wouldn't consciously think. It surprises you. It has wisdom or perspective you don't have. It feels autonomous, like you're encountering other, not talking to yourself. Record everything immediately. Write the dialogue verbatim. Draw the images. The act of recording grounds the experience and allows you to track the unconscious communication over time. Jung's examples from his Red Book. When Philemon appeared, the old man with kingfisher wings, Jung didn't just observe him. He engaged. "Who are you?" Philemon responded, "I am he who guides you through the realms of the dead." Jung, "Why do you appear now?" Philemon, "Because you are dead but don't know it yet." This wasn't Jung talking to himself. Philemon had his own personality, his own wisdom, said things Jung consciously disagreed with or didn't understand. Over time, Philemon became Jung's inner guide through the dark night, the self personified as wise old man who could navigate territory the ego couldn't. Why this works? Active imagination does several things simultaneously. Gives unconscious contents expression without having them possess you. Maintains ego boundaries while allowing. Ego self-dialogue transforms overwhelming chaos into relationship with specific figures, forces. Provides guidance system when rational mind has failed. Creates witness consciousness, you're experiencing and observing simultaneously. Common mistakes. Trying to control what emerges. The ego dictating to unconscious rather than listening. Analyzing instead of experiencing. Staying in head rather than allowing encounter. Abandoning practice when figures say difficult things. Literalizing the figures, believing they're external entities rather than aspects of psyche. Using it as escape rather than integration tool. The key, active imagination creates conscious relationship with the unconscious, forces initiating the dark night. Instead of being flooded, possessed, or destroyed by them, you're dialoguing with them, learning from them, integrating them gradually. Step 3. Shadow integration work. The principle, the shadow material erupting during dark night must be consciously integrated, not suppressed or acted out. What you resist persists. What you integrate becomes available energy rather than destructive force. The practice. When shadow content emerges, rage, destructive fantasies, forbidden desires, the parts of yourself you've denied, don't push it back down, but also don't act on it. Instead, acknowledge it. Yes, I contain this. This is part of me. Jung's approach. Write dialogues with your shadow. If your rage appears, personify it. Who are you, rage? Let it speak. I'm the anger you've suppressed for decades because you wanted to be good person. I'm your power that you denied. Ask, what do you need? It might answer, expression, recognition, integration into your choices rather than unconscious possession. This isn't therapy speak. This is concrete practice. Your shadow has intelligence. It emerged for reasons. When you relate to it consciously rather than being possessed by it or suppressing it, you discover what it's protecting, what authentic need it represents. Shadow as lost vitality. Most shadow material isn't actually evil. It's energy that was exiled because it didn't fit your persona or conditioning. Your selfish shadow might be healthy self-care. Your aggressive shadow might be necessary assertiveness. Your destructive shadow might be capacity to end what needs ending. When integrated, shadow becomes strength. Jung said, "I'd rather be whole than good." He meant I'd rather integrate all of myself, including darkness, than maintain facade of only light while my shadow runs my life unconsciously. The work, list qualities you judge in others. That's often projected shadow. Notice impulses you're horrified by. That's shadow demanding recognition. Explore in safe container, therapy, journaling, art, what these parts want. Find conscious ethical expression for the authentic needs behind shadow impulses. Develop capacity to hold paradox. I contain light and darkness, creation and destruction, love and rage. Jung's warning: if you don't integrate shadow consciously, it possesses you unconsciously. Affairs happen, violence erupts, self-sabotage occurs, not because you chose it, but because split-off parts are making choices outside awareness. The Dark Night forces shadow integration by making shadow too powerful to deny. Your choice is: integrate it or be destroyed by it. Step 4. Symbolic attitude development. The principle: everything happening during the dark night operates on symbolic level primarily, literal level secondarily. If you interpret symbolically, you navigate successfully. If you interpret only literally, you risk psychosis or suicide. What this means: when you dream of death, you're not dying. Your ego structure is dying. When you encounter archetypal figures, they're not external entities, they're autonomous aspects of your psyche. When you feel like you're going crazy, you're not going crazy. Your consciousness structure is reorganizing in ways that look like madness but follow coherent symbolic logic. Jung's key distinction: symbolic thinking holds that images, experiences, figures carry meaning beyond literal interpretation. The death you're experiencing is symbolically real, ego dying, without being literally real, body dying. The presence you sense is symbolically real, self-manifesting, without being literally real, external entity. People who can think symbolically navigate dark night toward transformation. People who think only concretely or literally often fragment because they can't hold the paradox. This is real, and it's symbolic. How to develop symbolic attitude. Study mythology, fairy tales, religious symbolism, not academically, but to understand that human psyche speaks in symbol language. When Bible says, "die to be reborn," it's not advocating suicide. It's describing psychological process of ego death leading to self-birth. Work with dreams symbolically. Snake in dream isn't just snake. It's transformation energy, death rebirth force, chthonic power. Death in dream isn't prediction. It's symbol of endings necessary for new beginnings. Read your dark night experiences as symbolic communications. The void isn't punishment. It's fertile darkness before creation. The dismemberment isn't destruction. It's alchemical solve et coagula, dissolve and recombine. The practice: when overwhelming experience happens, ask, what is this symbolically? What is my psyche communicating through this symbol? What transformation is this serving? This doesn't dismiss the experience as just symbolic. Symbols are psychologically real, but it prevents literalization that leads to catastrophe, killing yourself because you interpret ego death as instruction for physical death, or believing you're literally God because you experienced the self. Jung's emphasis: the people who survived their confrontation with the unconscious were those who could maintain symbolic awareness even during overwhelming experience. They could hold, "I'm experiencing something that feels like death, madness, divine possession," and this is a symbolic process with psychological function. That "and" saves lives. Step 5. The transcendent function, holding the tension. The principle: the transcendent function is Jung's concept of the psyche's self-healing capacity, its ability to create new synthesis from opposing forces when you hold the tension between them without collapsing into either. What this looks like in dark night: you're experiencing opposites, meaning and meaninglessness, death and rebirth, ego and self, terror and peace, fragmentation and coherence. The temptation is to collapse into one side or oscillate wildly, but if you can hold both simultaneously, I'm experiencing meaninglessness and transformation is happening. I'm dying and I'm being reborn. I'm fragmenting and I'm reorganizing. The psyche generates third position that transcends both. How to practice. When you notice opposites in tension, resist collapsing into either. Don't force positive meaning onto void, spiritual bypassing. Don't surrender to nihilism, meaninglessness as final truth. Hold both. This is empty, and this emptiness serves purpose. Journal the paradoxes. I feel dead inside and also more alive than ever. I've lost everything and I'm discovering what's real. I'm going mad and I'm waking up. This isn't contradiction, it's complexity. Your consciousness is learning to hold. Wait in the tension. Don't rush to resolution. The transcendent function requires time. When you hold impossible opposites long enough, new consciousness emerges that includes both rather than choosing between them. Jung's observation. People who navigate dark nights successfully develop capacity to hold paradox, ambiguity, tension between opposites. They become more complex, more nuanced. People who can't hold tension fragment, splitting into parts, or simplify, collapsing into one narrative. The dark night is training in holding tension, and that capacity to hold opposing truths simultaneously is mark of integrated consciousness. Step 6. Gradual ego reconstruction. The principle. After ego death, new ego must form, but it must form around self as center, not around persona or conditioning. And this formation happens gradually, organically, not through ego forcing it. What this means: don't try to quickly rebuild your identity, meaning structures, or life. Sit in disorganization longer than feels comfortable. Let new structure emerge from depths, rather than from ego's plans about who you should become. You'll have moments where new coherence appears, unfamiliar sense of self that doesn't match old identity but feels more real. Honor those moments, let them accumulate. Over time, they coalesce into new ego structure that's more spacious, less defended, organized around authenticity rather than survival. Jung's guidance. The new ego is servant of the self, not master of psyche. Old ego thought it was in charge. New ego understands it's part of larger system. This humbles ego without destroying it. You still have ego, you need ego to function, but it's right-sized now, not inflated. Practical steps. Make small decisions based on what actually feels true rather than what you should do. Notice what engages you now versus what engaged old self. Allow new interests, values, perspectives without judging them as wrong. Trust that new personality is forming even when you can't see final shape. Give it years, not months. The sign it's working. You feel more yourself than you ever have, but you couldn't have predicted who this self would be. The new you isn't who your ego planned to become. It's who emerged from allowing death and rebirth to complete. Step 7. Integration and embodiment. The principle. Mystical experiences, symbolic insights, and transformative realizations must be integrated into daily life and embodied in how you actually live. Otherwise, they're just peak experiences that fade, leaving you unchanged. The practice. After every significant experience, ask, how does this change how I treat people, how I work, how I relate to my body, my sexuality, my mortality? What does this insight require of me practically? Bring the transcendent into the immanent. Yes, you experienced cosmic consciousness now. How does that affect how you wash dishes, talk to your child, respond to traffic? If it doesn't change daily life, it's spiritual entertainment, not transformation. Jung's emphasis. Individuation isn't about collecting mystical experiences. It's about becoming whole, integrating shadow, relating consciously to unconscious, living authentically rather than from persona. This shows up in relationships, work, choices, how you treat yourself and others. The person who's navigated dark nights successfully is more grounded, more present, more capable of genuine relationship, not more spiritual seeming, not more detached from human life. Embodiment practices, somatic work to integrate psychological changes into body, bringing active imagination insights into actual choices. Testing spiritual insights against reality. Do they make you more functional or less? Service to others from your wound-turned gift. Living your authentic values rather than just understanding them. The goal. You emerge from dark night as more integrated human, more shadow-aware, more authentic, more capable of holding complexity, more in right relationship with the self. Not perfect, not enlightened, not beyond suffering, just more whole, more real, more yourself. This is Jung's blueprint. It's not easy. It requires years of dedicated work. It demands consciousness, courage, and support. But it's the difference between being destroyed by the dark night and being transformed through it. The question remains, what does this look like when it goes right versus when it goes catastrophically wrong? Let me show you through history, real people who either collapsed under the weight of their dark night or emerged transformed. The contrast reveals what determines the outcome. The dark night doesn't discriminate. It comes for the brilliant and the ordinary, the prepared and the unprepared, the supported and the isolated. But outcomes vary dramatically based on one factor. Did they have the tools, support, and understanding to navigate it consciously? Let me show you the pattern through real lives, some who were consumed by their confrontation with the unconscious, and others who were transformed by it. Failures, the ones who didn't return. Friedrich Nietzsche, the philosopher who touched God and fractured Nietzsche, understood something profound. His writings on the death of God, the abyss gazing back, becoming who you are, these weren't abstract philosophy. They were documentation of his own confrontation with the void, with meaninglessness, with the task of creating values in a universe without inherent meaning. In his early work, he was navigating brilliantly. Beyond good and evil, thus spoke Zarathustra. These show someone walking the knife edge between ego dissolution and new consciousness. His concept of the Übermensch wasn't about superiority. It was about the human who can create meaning after the death of all inherited meaning. It was about conscious navigation of the dark night. But around 1889, something broke. In Turin, Italy, Nietzsche saw a horse being beaten. He collapsed, threw his arms around the horse's neck, and wept. Then he fractured completely. Delusions of grandeur. He believed he was Dionysus, that he was Christ, that he had split the earth in two. Letters signed the Crucified and Dionysus. Complete psychotic break from which he never recovered. He spent the last 11 years of his life in mental collapse, cared for by his mother and sister, unable to write, unable to function. The brilliant mind that had touched such profound truth, now lost in grandiose delusion. What went wrong? Nietzsche navigated alone. He had no Jung, no guide, no one who understood what he was experiencing. He had philosophical framework, but no psychological practices for integration. He touched the numinous, experienced ego dissolution, confronted the void, glimpsed what humans could become, but he had no container strong enough to hold it. His ego inflated around his visions. Instead of recognizing he was experiencing the self, he began identifying as the self. He was Dionysus. He was Christ. The ego, instead of dying and reforming around the self, inflated to divine proportions. And isolation accelerated his collapse. No reality testing. No one to say, Friedrich, you're experiencing something profound, but you're not literally God. Just alone in his room, writing letters as the Crucified, convinced of his own divinity. Jung studied Nietzsche extensively and concluded he was destroyed by the same forces that I barely survived. The difference was that he had no method for containing them. Vincent van Gogh, the artist whose vision consumed him. Van Gogh's paintings show someone seeing reality's hidden dimensions, the energy vibrating in cypress trees, the stars as living presences, color as spiritual force. His letters reveal classic dark night experiences, overwhelming sensitivity, feeling everything too deeply, inability to function in ordinary world, sense of divine presence in nature, psychological suffering beyond depression. He had mystical sensitivity. He saw through the veil, but he had no framework for understanding it, no practices for grounding it, no support system that recognized his visions as potentially meaningful rather than only pathological. His paintings from the asylum period, The Starry Night, Wheatfield with Crows, show someone in full dark night, apocalyptic vision, death and beauty intertwined, the cosmos alive and terrifying. He was painting his confrontation with the unconscious, but it consumed him. Multiple psychiatric hospitalizations, episodes where he couldn't distinguish inner vision from outer reality, the famous incident where he cut off his ear, possession by unconscious forces he couldn't contain, and finally, at 37, suicide. A shot to the chest in a wheat field. Dead 2 days later. His last words, "The sadness will last forever." What went wrong? Van Gogh had mystical sensitivity without psychological container. His visions were real. He was seeing what most people can't see. But he couldn't integrate what he was seeing. He couldn't distinguish between symbolic and literal, between self and ego, between transformative vision and psychotic episode. He sought help, but 1880s psychiatry had no framework for understanding spiritual emergency. They could only diagnose and institutionalize. The treatments, restraints, isolation, diagnostic confusion likely made it worse. And he was alone in his understanding. His brother Theo supported him financially, but couldn't understand psychologically what Vincent was experiencing. The isolation, the lack of anyone who could witness and guide, accelerated his collapse. Jung's assessment: he was an artist shaman without the shamanic tradition to hold him. He died of what he saw because he saw it alone. David Foster Wallace, the writer who understood but couldn't survive. Wallace's fiction reveals someone who understood the dark night intellectually. His descriptions of depression, meaninglessness, the horror of consciousness, the void, these aren't speculation, they're documentation. He knew this territory intimately. Infinite Jest is essentially a 1,000-page exploration of the dark night, addiction as attempt to escape unbearable consciousness, entertainment as distraction from void, the search for meaning in meaningless universe, the terror of truly seeing reality without filters. But understanding doesn't equal surviving. Wallace battled depression for decades, multiple hospitalizations, ECT treatment, medication trials. He had psychiatric support, he had success, he had people who loved him, but the void won anyway. 2008, at 46, suicide by hanging. Brilliant mind, profound insight into the human condition, but couldn't navigate his own dark night to the other side. What went wrong? Even with understanding, even with support, some dark nights are too severe or strike psyches too vulnerable. Wallace's depression had biological components that medication sometimes helped, sometimes didn't. When medication stopped working, the void became unbearable. He had intellectual framework, but perhaps not enough embodied practices. He could write about the dark night brilliantly, but couldn't necessarily integrate it somatically, couldn't hold it in his body as well as his mind. And timing matters. Not everyone survives. Not because they're weak, but because some combination of biological vulnerability, lack of right support at right time, or severity of crisis becomes fatal. This isn't failure, it's tragedy. The pattern in failure's isolation, navigating without guidance, witness, or support. No practices, understanding intellectually without embodied integration techniques. inflation or literalization, confusing self with ego or confusing symbolic with literal no container, psychiatric or psychological support that doesn't understand spiritual dimension, biological vulnerability, depression, trauma history, or neurological factors that make navigation exponentially harder. Successes. The ones who returned transformed Carl Jung, the psychiatrist who became his own first patient. We've discussed Jung's dark night, but his success deserves emphasis. 1913-1930, confrontation with the unconscious that looked like psychosis, felt like death, nearly killed him. But he emerged with entire framework of depth psychology. What went right? He developed practices, active imagination, dream work, symbolic attitude, specifically to navigate what was happening. He maintained minimal tether to external reality through continued clinical work. He had Emma, his wife, who provided grounding even when she didn't understand. He took his visions seriously without literalizing them. Philemon was real psychologically, not literally. He was experiencing the self, not becoming God. This distinction saved him from inflation, and he used his descent as research. He documented everything in what became the Red Book. He treated his own psychosis-like experiences as data about the human psyche rather than just personal pathology. This gave it meaning, structure, purpose. The Jung who emerged was fundamentally different from the one who entered. More humble, more aware of unconscious forces, more capable of holding complexity, and he spent the rest of his life helping others navigate similar territory. Saint John of the Cross, the mystic who named the territory, 16th century Spanish mystic who underwent what he called the dark night of the soul, the experience of God's absence, loss of all consolation, psychological death preceding mystical union. His writings document classic dark night phenomenology, but he navigated successfully because he had container, monastic tradition with centuries of maps for this territory, spiritual directors who understood contemplative crisis, community of monks who'd witnessed this in others, practices, prayer, contemplation, service that grounded the experience. He emerged from his dark night with profound mystical capacity, experiences of divine union that he could articulate poetically and theologically. His writings guided millions through similar territory for 400 years. What went right? Tradition. He wasn't inventing navigation system from scratch. He was following well-worn path with guides who'd traveled it. The monastic container provided external structure while his internal world dissolved. He had symbolic framework, Catholic mystical theology that gave meaning to suffering without forcing premature positive reframing. The suffering itself was understood as purgation, preparation for union, and he gave it time. Years. He didn't rush, didn't try to fix it quickly, trusted the process because his tradition taught that dark night was stage, not destination. Viktor Frankl, the psychiatrist who found meaning in the death camp. Frankl's experience in Nazi concentration camps was collective dark night, confrontation with meaninglessness, with death, with human capacity for evil, with the question, why continue living when everything is stripped away? He survived not just physically but psychologically. In the camps, he observed who survived and who collapsed. His conclusion, those who maintained meaning survived. Not happiness, meaning, purpose that transcended suffering. He emerged from Auschwitz and wrote Man's Search for Meaning in 9 days. The experience, instead of destroying him, became foundation for logotherapy, helping others find meaning, even in suffering. What went right? He maintained witness consciousness, even in hell. Part of him observed and analyzed, even while experiencing. This created psychological distance that prevented complete overwhelm. He had framework, his pre-existing psychiatric knowledge, that helped him understand what he was witnessing. The dark night wasn't random chaos. It was meaningful psychological process. And crucially, he used his descent as service. The suffering had purpose. It would help others. This transformed personal trauma into collective gift. Rainer Maria Rilke, the poet who welcomed the darkness. Rilke's letters and poems document extended spiritual crisis, years of inability to write, overwhelming sensitivity, profound loneliness, confrontation with death and meaninglessness. But he didn't fight it, he welcomed it. His famous advice, perhaps all the dragons of our lives are princesses who are only waiting to see us act just once with beauty and courage. Perhaps everything that frightens us is, in its deepest essence, something helpless that wants our love. He treated his dark night as visitation, not punishment. The 10 years between his early work and the Duino elegies were years in the void, but he trusted it. And what emerged, the elegies and sonnets to Orpheus, are among the most profound poetry ever written, documenting death and rebirth consciousness. What went right? Artist's relationship to suffering. He had capacity to transform psychological content into art, which provided both expression and meaning for the chaos. He didn't pathologize his experience. He understood it as necessary for his development as artist and human. This allowed him to bear it longer without collapsing into despair. And he had solitude without complete isolation. He withdrew from society but maintained correspondence with friends. Letters provided witness without intrusion. The pattern in successes: container, therapeutic, spiritual, or communal support that understood this as meaningful practices, concrete techniques for working with unconscious material, symbolic awareness, holding that experiences were real, symbolically without becoming literal, meaning-making, finding purpose in the suffering that transcended personal pain, time and patience, allowing years for integration rather than forcing quick resolution service orientation, using their descent as preparation for helping others. The determining factors. When you compare failures to successes, the pattern is clear. Failure comes from isolation, so no practices, spouse literalization or inflation. No meaning-making, impatience or giving up, biological trauma, vulnerability, overwhelming resources. Success comes from support, practices, symbolic awareness, meaning-making, patience. Sufficient psychological resources to bear the process. This doesn't mean success is guaranteed if you have the right factors. Some people have everything right and still don't survive. Tragedy happens, but the factors dramatically increase odds of transformation rather than destruction. And here's what matters for you. If you're in the dark night now, these factors are within your control. You can find support, you can learn practices, you can develop symbolic attitude, you can search for meaning, you can commit to seeing it through. You can assess whether you need additional support if trauma or biology make this overwhelming. The historical contrast shows navigation is possible. People have survived worse than what you're experiencing, but survival requires conscious engagement, not just endurance. Now let me show you Jung's own journey in detail, how the master nearly didn't survive his own dark night, and what he learned that saved him.